Welcome to PBCJ's live coverage of the Lower House. I'm Simone Absalom. The session will start with prayers, followed by a roll call of those in attendance. This is usually followed by questions and answers to questions, statements by ministers, items under public business, and private members' motions. Before we begin, let's try a Parliament trivia. In addition to the separation of functions of the legislature, executive, and judiciary, a number of checks and balances have been established by the Constitution to limit the power of the executive. Is this true or false? Get the answer at the end of this introduction to the Lower House. The answer will also be posted on our Facebook page. On the agenda in this session, under public business, the Income Tax Amendment Act 2019 is to be tabled and taken. The Provisional Collection of Tax, Assets Tax, Specified Bodies, Confirmation and Extension Order 2019 Resolution will also be taken. Under private members' motions, the House is to continue debate on private members' motion number 5 by Reverend Arnold regarding policies to enhance agricultural and agro-processing skills and increase access to credit for agricultural purposes. Also on the agenda, the sectoral debate continues this week with opposition spokesperson for Ministry of Local Government, Dr. Angela Brown-Burke, set to make her presentation. The sectoral debate is based on a motion brought by a government member seeking the approval of the House for government's proposed programs and projects within the different sectors. Every year, following the budget debate, the House of Representatives, the lower house, engages in another round of presentations known as the sectoral debates. Time is allotted for 2 sittings per week over a 6-week period following the close of the budget debate conducted at the start of the new fiscal year in April. That's what's on the agenda. It should be noted that the day's agenda can be changed or moved. But before we go, here are a few things you should bear in mind if you plan to attend a session at Gordon House. No visitor shall create any act of disorder within the precincts of the House. No visitor shall be admitted to the House without first obtaining an admission card. Visitors who remain within the precincts of the House during a suspension of the session are asked to keep silent. No photography, videography, or sketching of the proceedings is allowed unless so authorized by the presiding officer. And there should be no smoking inside the parliamentary building. Now for the answer to the Parliament trivia. We asked, in addition to the separation of functions of the legislature, executive, and judiciary, a number of checks and balances have been established by the Constitution to limit the power of the executive. It's true. In addition to the separation of functions of the legislature, executive, and judiciary, a number of checks and balances have been established by the Constitution to limit the power of the executive. These include the offices of the Leader of Opposition, Auditor General, and Director of Public Prosecutions, and more. Now over to the proceedings.
Mr. Witter, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Holness, Mr. Clark, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Mr. Montego, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck. Tell him to really talk about the Mace. Tell him to get the phone for the Mace. Tell him to, because I might have a couple. Mr. Henry, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Malahuford, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Green, Mr. Terry Long, Mr. Main, Mrs. Malahoo Fort, Mr. R. Scott, Mr. Azan, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brownberg, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Campbell, Mr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Miss Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Miss Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mr. Olness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kelly, Dr. McNeil, Miss Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mrs. Vaz, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Wright.
Members, we are starting this session in a poor way. Before the Mace was put in place, members were chatting to one another on both sides of the House. And I think it is wrong. We are being televised worldwide. And I don't want to say much because I am being televised too, except to remind members that there is a standard in this House set out by members of this House, past and present. And I'm going to ask that we abide by those standards set out in the standing orders. When the Parliament is adjourned, members start to walk out before the Mace is even taken up, start to chat and carry on in a way which is unacceptable. I'm not speaking of any special side now because it's happening among members of Parliament. And I'm going to ask that we keep a standard that those who are in the gallery can be so advised as to the standard we want, and those watching us can see it. Please. Statement by Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our sitting today will comprise the taking of legislation, the Income Tax Amendment Act 2019 will be taken. As to whether it will go through all its stages today, we are not certain, but the Minister of Finance, I expect him to be here shortly. He will also take the provisional collection of tax assets, tax specified bodies, confirmation and extension order 2019 resolution. Mr. Speaker, the private member's motion that was dealt with at number 5 by the Reverend Arnold, member for Central Kingston, will be responded to by the Minister of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries, and any other member who wishes to make their contribution to that resolution. We intend also to have the private member's motion at number 37, item 37, by the member from East Central St. Andrew, and then we will have the contribution to the sectoral debate by Dr. Angela Brown-Burke, who will make her contribution today. What? What did he say?
Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following. Ministry paper number 28 of 2019 entitled The Law Reform Zones of Special Operations, Special Security and Community Development Measures, the Denham Town Community Zone, Social Intervention. Ministry paper number 29 of 2019 entitled The Law Reform Zones of Special Operations, Special Security and Community Development Measures, the Mount Salem Community and Environs in the Parish of St. James Zone, Social Intervention. Ministry papers number 30 to 33 of 2019 entitled Cabinet Agenda Issues dated March 11, 18 and 25 and April 8, 2019. Annual reports of the Jamaica Fire Brigade for the years 2014, 2015 and 2015-2016. The Provisional Collection of Tax Asset, the Provisional Collection of Tax Act, Asset Tax Specified Bodies, Confirmation and Extension Order 2019 Resolution, and the Jamaica Gazette Supplement Proclamations, Rule and Regulations, Legal Notice number 48A dated Thursday, March 28, 2019, and the Provisional Collection of Tax Act, Asset Tax Specified Body Order 2019. Appropriation accounts for head 2803023 and 28031 for Court of Appeal and Attorney General's Department for the year 2017-2018, respectively.
Mr. Speaker, Ministry Paper 3219. There might be a problem here. I noticed that a member of the Gender Advisory Board, I assume is our colleague in Parliament here, I say the name appear of a member of Parliament, a member of that board. In my 20 years in Parliament, it's the first I've seen a member of Parliament serving a government board. I think there might be some breach of protocol and that this board might need to be reconstituted. So I believe we need some advice. We need some advice before this can move forward. It is laid here, and it is cabinet agenda issue of March 25th. It says that cabinet approved the appointment of the following person to the council with effect from the 25th of March 2019 to the 7th of January 2021, when the term of the council will expire. Number 6 says Dr. Angela Brown-Burke, and I assume is a member of Parliament for Southwest St. Andrew. And if that is so, I think it's a breach of protocol, and we need some legal advice where this is concerned. I've never heard of a member of Parliament serving on a government board ever since I've been here for 20 years. So this needs to be investigated and appropriate advice given to the relevant area as such. It's wrong.
Member, let's have some order, please. We are in Parliament. Mr. Warmington, I have listened to your presentation, and I will check this out and inform you. I'll do a check. I cannot inform you, but I'll check and inform you before the next sitting. Bills brought from the Senate. Order, please. Members, we are in Parliament, and the Parliament is in session. Let us treat the Parliament with the standard it deserves. Bills brought from the Senate. Petitions. Papers. Reports from committees. Notices of motion given orally. Mr. Twigg.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Be it resolved that the provisions of Section 40, subsection 2A of the Constitution of Jamaica be repealed.
Mr. Semudo.
What are you telling me? Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Be it resolved that this Honourable House place on record its profound regret at the passing of the Most Honourable Edward Philip George Seaga, ONPC, former Prime Minister, former Leader of the Opposition, former Minister of Finance and Planning, and former Minister of Development and Welfare, who passed away on the 28th day of May 2019. Be it further resolved that this Honourable House also record its appreciation for the outstanding service rendered by Mr. Seaga to the Parliament and people of Jamaica, and also his contribution to sports and the framing of Jamaica's Constitution. And be it further resolved that a copy of this resolution be conveyed to his widow and family with expressions of deepest sympathy.
Questions? Dr. Clark?
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the Provisional Collection of Tax Act, the Provisional Collection of Tax Assets Tax, Specified Bodies Confirmation and Extension Order 2019 Resolution. And the resolution, Mr. Speaker, says the Provisional Collection of Tax Act, the Provisional Collection of Tax Assets Tax, Specified Bodies, Confirmation and Extension Order 2019 Resolution. Whereas, by virtue of Section 3, subsection 1 of the Provisional Collection of Tax Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, the Minister may make an order published in the Gazette providing for the variation, renewal, or imposition of any tax, and whereas the Provisional Collection of Tax, Asset Tax, Specified Bodies Order 2019 was made by the Minister and published in the Jamaica Gazette Supplement, Proclamations, Rules and Regulations, the Gazette, number 25A, dated March 28, 2019, and whereas it is provided by Section 3, subsection 3 of the Act, that an order made shall continue for a period of 6 months, hereinafter referred to as the initial period, next following publication thereof in the Gazette, provided that the House of Representatives may by resolution authorize the continuance in force of the order for any additional period of 3 months, And whereas it is provided by Section 3, subsection 4 of the Act, that an order made under Section 3, subsection 1 of the Act shall cease to have effect if it is not confirmed with or without modification by resolution of the House of Representatives within the next 30 days on which the House sits after the date of publication of the Gazette, and whereas it is desirable that the provisional collection of assets tax specified bodies order 2019 be confirmed and authorized to continue in force for an additional period of 3 months, commencing immediately before the expiration of the initial period, now therefore be it resolved by this Honourable House of Representatives as follows. 1. The resolution may be cited as the Provisional Collection of Assets Tax Specified Bodies Order 2019 Confirmation and Extension Resolution, and 2. The Provisional Collection of Asset Tax Specified Bodies Order 2019 is hereby confirmed and authorized to continue in force for an additional period of 3 months, commencing immediately before the expiration of the initial period. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take this motion.
Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Public business. Minister Samuda, before you proceed, members, I wish to bring to your attention a matter of concern. The Parliament refurbishes its Mace. When the Senate meets tomorrow, or the day in which it is fixed for its meeting, which it fixes meeting, it will be using the recently refurbished 1753 Mace. The Mace was refurbished as part of the Parliament's Mace Conservation Project, which will see both Parliament Mace being refurbished. Renowned Canadian conservator Alexander Gabor is conducting the conservation treatment. The Mace is a symbol of royal authority and must be in place when meetings of the Senate and the House of Representatives are held. The Parliament's Mace were made in 1753 and in 1787. For more than 20 years, only one Mace was being used by both houses, as the 1753 Mace had undergone structural damages and was severely tarnished. Until the 1787 Mace is repaired, the 1753 Mace will be used for all meetings of Parliament. It is expected that repairs will be completed by the 21st of June this year. Once both Mace have been repaired and restored, the 1753 Mace will be used for the Senate, its meeting, and at the Senate's meeting, and the 1787 Mace will be used for the meeting of the House of Representatives. I bring this to your attention because you will note that there is a change in the Mace at this meeting. Thank you. Mr. Semuda.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, consistent with our Mr. Speaker, the House cannot. What is that? Put on your mic.
The standard of our members has fallen way below what is expected of it. And I'm going to adjourn the House until you are ready for me. Whatever business you have, you are here to do the people's business in the House of Representatives. And we want a standard to be kept. Please, members, even when I'm speaking, you're not responding. And I'm going to call names of the members and ask them to go outside and conduct their business. I'm sorry that you have to come to a standard like this. It's unnecessary. And we are being watched around the world. Thank you, Mr. Semuda. You may proceed.
It is obvious, Mr. Speaker, that the members have become overly familiar with each other. And in the hope that that will be diminished so that we will conduct the business of the House in good order, I wish to point out that consistent with our practice through these sectorial debates, where we proceed to take that contribution first and then recommit other matters to be dealt with by the House. I now invite you, or request of you, that you invite the member from Southwest St. Andrew to make her contribution.
Thank you. Permission to speak from a seat other than my own?
You may go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, colleagues. Good afternoon. I give thanks to the giver of life, the one who woke me up this morning and has provided me with another opportunity to use my voice to try to make a difference. I do this being mindful of the words of King Solomon, as taught to him by his mother in Proverbs. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. Mr. Speaker, I know that we on this side are always mindful of that exhortation and the rich and proud history of the People's National Party as a champion of the working class. I am therefore very pleased to be counted among my colleagues and comrades. I am also humbled to be given the opportunity by the Leader of Opposition, Dr. Peter Phillips, to shadow the local government portfolio. At the same time, I'm conscious that the wonderful, warm, loving people of Southwest St. Andrew have put their faith in me to be their voice and champion in this House. It has been almost 2 years since they welcomed me as a new member to their family. They have allowed me into their homes and their lives. They have shared their deepest concerns, their fears, and their aspirations with me. I owe a debt of gratitude to my PD workers, my delegates, community leaders, community members, the divisional and constituency teams headed by my officers and councillors, Eugene Kelly, Carl Blake, Audrey Smith-Facey, Carmen Alleman, Cadian Little, and Lorenzo Ellis. Very special thanks to all the residents, business operators, and institutions who have been committed to making sure that Southwest St. Andrew continues to grow. How can I ever thank my family in the office
for the sacrifices they continue to make. Shanti, Juby, Dryden, Doreen, Avis, Gail, Sayer, thank you very much. Yes, last but by no means least, I also say thanks to my husband and sons for being my rock and solace. They keep me grounded, reminding me that I'm not Superwoman, and that as long as there's life, there's an opportunity to keep hope alive and keep moving forward. Mr. Speaker, let me now turn to my shadow spokesperson responsibility. Local government is one of those portfolios that seem all-encompassing. There are so many areas that fall under the responsibility of the local authorities, all of them important to improving governance and the quality of life of all Jamaicans. So please bear with me today as I seek to speak on just a few. As one who believes passionately in the difference that can be made by a caring and responsive government, I believe local government should really bridge the ever-widening social and economic gap. At the very least, it should prevent many from falling over the proverbial economic and social cliff. This has inspired the title of today's presentation, Our Citizens Deserve Better. Let's find the solutions. In 2015, the government, under former Minister of Local Government, Noel Arscott, passed what we call 3 strategic laws. I believe that we are now at a point where we need to revisit them, looking at what has worked or not worked and why. The government must revisit the legislative framework to provide solutions for our citizens and create in them a sense of belonging in a society for which they are willing to sacrifice. Mr. Speaker, the Governance Act in 2015 speaks to citizens' participation. And you know, our citizens are demanding that civic participation goes beyond the mere attendance at town hall meetings or demonstrations, however effective those are. They want a say in decisions that affect their life, the future of their children, the progress of their communities. The people need to have a real say in how their money is spent. They have a right to help to define the annual work plans, to monitor the progress of those plans and achievements of those who work for them. After all, let us not forget that the municipality belongs to the people. Performance, greater transparency, accountability, and inclusion are what our people need, and it is also what they're asking for. The laws facilitate that, but how much of that have we really been doing? In relation to the Financial Act, time comes for a review of the role of the minister in an effort to eliminate the ambiguity in relation to the spending of the parochial revenue fund and the financial decisions taken by committees and council. Frankly, there are just too many reports of senior staff of local authority refusing to follow through on decisions of the local council based on what they say will be contrary decisions of the minister. Mr. Speaker, as an opposition, we are committed to providing solutions and not just pointing out problems. I suggest, therefore, that for greater transparency and while we await the review of these laws, that the local authorities be provided with details of the parochial revenue fund on a periodic basis, allowing them to monitor the sums collected, the portions assigned, and its timely disbursement. Mr. Speaker, when we think of municipal corporations, we automatically think of traditional responsibilities, including physical infrastructure and the nuts and bolts of city operations, water, road, waste management, cemeteries, markets, and so on. The big ticket items is what we like to call them. But as many councillors would attest, they are also called upon to sponsor recreation programs, summer camps, sports competitions, and so on. and emerging research is pointing to the need to respond to prevailing economic, social, and political conditions and seizing the opportunities that these present. And since funding is never enough, here is an opportunity for collaborative work, for building true partnership with private sector, community members, and charitable organizations. Mr. Speaker, I have sat here on several occasions listening to the government speaking glowingly of their promise of prosperity. And I have heard them try to convince us that the prosperity train is here. They have announced the number of tickets that have been sold, the number of passengers who have boarded the prosperity train with great fanfare and to thunderous applause. But when I step through those doors and I speak to Jamaicans, whether they are from Southwest St. Andrew, West Central St. Andrew, St. James, Clarendon, or any of the 14 parishes, persons tell me that they haven't seen the prosperity train. In fact, many tell me that they are worse off today than they were 2 years ago. They tell the story of rising costs at the corner shop and at the supermarket. They tell me that they are weighed down by medical bills and that every day they face the difficult decision of choosing between putting food on the table or paying their water bill, choosing between sending their kids to school or helping mama or papa. Mr. Speaker, the only choice for too many of our law-abiding citizens nowadays is how to merely survive, because they cannot afford the cost of living a full and meaningful life. Mr. Speaker, I want to remind us that it is the sworn duty of our municipal corporations to stand in the breach and protect our people. The municipal corporations, therefore, cannot become those who parrot automatically the prosperity slogan. Because in Jamaica in 2019, Mr. Speaker, that is all prosperity is, a slogan. A slogan. Local government has always been seen as being the closest to the people. And now more than ever, municipal corporations must find solutions that protect those who are closest, and especially those who need it most. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a little bit about some of the promises that we have heard in the past made by the Minister of Local Government. Promises. I acknowledge the work being done in some of the more important areas by the Minister of Local Government. I acknowledge, too, that the present government has maintained the fiscal discipline for which the previous administration fought hard and for which Jamaican people made a tremendous sacrifice. I am equally pleased that the latitude that is now being enjoyed as a result of this greater fiscal space in some instances are being used to improve the ability of our departments and agencies to respond effectively to the needs of our citizens. At the same time, it's important for us to understand what needs to be done to ensure that these gestures are not just symbolic, but that they in fact make a difference in the lives of our citizens. So let's look at last year, for example. Last year, the minister announced an increase in allocation to councils and municipal corporations for social assistance. As one would expect, as soon as the announcements were made, many individuals approached councillors for financial assistance, for social or indigent housing, funeral grants, educational grants. Suffice it to say, after the grand announcement last year, allocations were not made on a timely basis. In fact, reports I've received suggest that some municipal corporations were asked to advance the money, and some did from their own source revenue. Some of those who advanced, they have been reimbursed, but others have not. And what that means is that they have been deprived of funds that could be otherwise allocated. But more disappointing than those municipal corporations and councillors is the fact that so many were unable to advance the money, and therefore, despite the numerous requests, they have simply been unable to deal with the funeral or housing grants that were promised. Minister, these are not matters to be taken lightly, not only because of the potential damage to the trust that is essential between citizens and their representatives, but also because of the pain and sometimes the indignity of the process. Our citizens deserve better than this. Mr. Speaker, it is against that background, therefore, that this year I very cautiously applaud the announcement of an increased allocation for education and a special program to repair the homes of the registered poor. After all, we know that the devil is always in the details. So I have some concerns. I start by saying it's an excellent initiative by the minister, in particular the construction of concrete houses for indigent persons. But while that is laudable, the 11 homes built last year across the island just is not enough. We have to do better than that. Our citizens certainly deserve better. Only 11. Minister, let me suggest here, as with the social programs, that there be some mutual understanding between the Ministry of Local Government and the local authorities as to the expectations around the number of indigent houses to be built, the eligibility criteria, timelines, and the process that will be used to complete this. At this point, Mr. Speaker, allow me to place on record my own appreciation for the officers of the Poor Relief Departments, the infirmaries, the Board of Supervision, the Ministry of Social Security, and all those who serve the outdoor poor and indigent. I certainly know firsthand just how difficult that job is. And I know too the passion and dedication and the creativity that goes into making a difference. I also know that they would have welcomed the announcement of improved infrastructure at the infirmaries and drop-in centers, especially, as the minister indicated, with the expected increase in the occupancy of these institutions. So please ensure that adequate medical services and supplies are put in place to respond to their needs. Mr. Speaker, it's also refreshing to have some of these functions return to the local authority. This has been a discussion that has been long in coming, and it is a welcome move as it provides a more coordinated approach to services provided by local government. However, I must caution the minister that these duties cannot return without the necessary budgetary support to effectively attend to the needs of the residents. Far too often, we have seen responsibilities returned to the local authority without the necessary funding, expecting them to create miracles, and then persons are surprised that they have been unable to effectively carry out these functions. Now I turn to, Mr. Speaker, to the National Solid Waste Management Authority. And again, I acknowledge the positive move to provide an increase in salaries and other benefits to sidemen and other workers. That's a good thing. I want to say, however, that I've seen a few of them on television saying that they are unaware of the announcements that were made before. So again, from the solutions-oriented perspective, I want to suggest that the management of the Solid Waste Management Authority, and for greater understanding, that a proper notice be sent to the workers to formally indicate the improved benefit package. It makes a good PR for the government to say it on TV. but it is not good practice for people management in the workplace. Mr. Speaker, I hope as well that the Minister of Local Government will join me in pushing the Minister of Finance to make subventions on time so that these workers can actually enjoy the increases and benefits that they have been afforded. You know, decent work and a livable wage is serious business, and it is of even more importance in a land where some talk of prosperity, but only a few are privileged to have the opportunity to experience it. I also believe that the increase to the fleet for the garbage trucks, whether it was through repairs, acquisitions, or the proposed rentals, that's also a good thing. Again, however, I wish to put on the table some solutions to enable a smoother operations and cleaner communities, and to make sure that we are cognizant of the reality in which we live. So the 143 trucks, for example, proposed by the minister, I do not believe will be adequate to move the country to an acceptable standard of twice weekly collection. No, it won't. And therefore, what is required is a reliable schedule of collection and sufficient trucks assigned to our town centers and major thoroughfares, and a system that also allows citizens to indicate when the system isn't working. We also need, I believe, a more robust public education program to influence our habits in relation to garbage collection and disposal. And I believe our schools are a good place to start. We have done it before, and it can be done again. I am suggesting some of these immediate action in an effort to have cleaner living spaces for our citizens, because I really believe that they deserve it. Mr. Speaker, the recurring problems resulting from the management of fires at our landfills is still a problem. Each time there is a fire, the cost to the country is estimated at millions in lost hours, deteriorating air quality, healthcare costs for citizens, and the added burden to a healthcare system already in crisis. So, Minister, what of the enterprise team? It's now time for a clear solution for the sustainable management of our solid waste. We have been waiting for almost 3 years for a permanent relocation of the dumps and to hear of the results of their research and their proposal, and still not a word. We were once excited to talk about waste to energy. Now the rest of the world is talking about creating a circular economy, moving to zero waste. Where is Jamaica in this discussion? We don't know, because we still have not heard from the enterprise team, and nobody else in the interim is speaking. Mr. Speaker, our markets are important hubs of economic activity within our parishes. They provide an opportunity for healthy living and a source of income for many persons, including farmers from right across the country. Most of our vendors and our customers too are women. And you know, as a former commissioner of police said to me many years ago, most of these markets are not designed with security concerns in mind. It is therefore important to ensure that repairs and construction of modern markets guarantee the dignity and the safety of the users of our markets. Mr. Speaker, let me place on record how very disappointed I have been with the slow pace of repairs promised last year. I do hope, however, that the new promise to implement the market rehabilitation project will come to fruition during this financial year, because I believe our citizens deserve better. I'm also urging our local authorities not to let the minister off the hook and to insist on market upgrade, rehabilitation, and construction this year. Mr. Speaker, I will not say much about the fiasco of the Constant Spring market, except to say that the government lost an opportunity to show that they understood the plight of the innovative entrepreneurs who were legal occupants making a living there for generations. Instead, they adopted an arrogant posture and used the weight and might of the municipal corporation to forcibly remove the vendors instead of engaging them as law-abiding citizens. It's not just about what you do, it is also about how it is done. You know, I wanted to talk a little bit about accountability and good governance, because I believe that it is important between a government and its people. And lest we forget, the Auditor General's report spoke of a decision of the government of Jamaica to rent a premises for $76 million per annum for a 5-year period. $380 million commitment for 5 years. And that is in addition to the renovation works that would have been undertaken at the new location. About what, $80 million that was? So, Mr. Speaker, let's accept the minister's argument that the previous property was unsuitable and that new offices were required. Minister, $380 million. Do you rent or do you buy? What is the best value for the Jamaican taxpayers? And then, to add insult to injury, you end up miscalculating the payment to the tune of $7.1 million. Then you see a little shed outside and you decide to pay $2.7 million per annum to park there. With all the skills and knowledge available to the ministry, is this the best that could be done? Where is the fiscal prudence and the due diligence that should precede the spending of the already limited resources? You know, there's just so much more that could have been done. Vector control activities, SDC to support their programs, LED, capacity building, sports. What about more money to PMI for intervention in our different communities riddled with crime? Mr. Speaker, let me say categorically, after examining the AG report, that I am not impressed with the commitment of the ministry to, as they say, implement control systems and mechanisms to streamline and guide these similar projects. Again, being solutions-oriented, I want to remind the minister that the public is still looking forward to have a clear understanding of where the failures occurred, who has been held responsible. And we also want to know whether or not these breaches were identified before the AG's report or after the AG's report, and what is being done. We need to know. The sequence of decisions and activities suggests a lack of understanding of the plight of the Jamaican people and a disregard for diligence with taxpayers' money. Unfortunately, this kind of negligence and incompetence seems now to be a characteristic of the present administration, and the truth is, our citizens deserve it. The other point that must be made here is that the Ministry of Local Government has responsibility for several agencies and departments, as well as 14 municipal corporations. The ministry has responsibility to ensure a system of accountability and prudent decision-making. So, if this that occurred, as indicated by the AG, is the standard set that we should then expect from these other agencies, then dog name will suffer. Minister, I suggest that the ministry has an obligation to lift the bar and set a higher standard. I want to turn to an issue that has been with me since January 2013, when I made a call in another place for medical cannabis to be legalized. At the time, it wasn't meant as an exclusive club, although I appreciated that standards and regulations were definitely needed. In 2015, I supported the legislation from my position in the Senate as an advocate, proud to have been part of balancing the scale of social justice. So much has happened since then that it is no longer a progressive act. It is now a prohibitive legislation, exclusionary, and in need of serious and urgent review. And that is why I'm making the case for legalization as part of the process towards economic justice. And I start with the name, a most negative one, the Dangerous Drug Amendment 2015 Act. I support the ganja growers' call for a Jamaica Cannabis Development Act, a much more positive classification. I'm also advocating for a relaxed but regulated legal recreational industry that would not require the prohibitive regulations and costs of the present medicinal regime. Mr. Speaker, many constituents, like Southwest St. Andrew, are made up of hard-working people, unemployed young people, marginalized youth, proud, struggling women and men, all seeking a better quality of life for themselves and their families. And I'm sure, based on the statistics, that there are many young persons who are currently involved in the ganja trade. It is therefore unacceptable that they cannot participate in or create an economic opportunity growing and selling to others in what is a local ganja trade. In July 2018, last year, almost a year ago, I tabled a private member's motion in Parliament here, calling for the legalization of ganja. It is still to be debated. So today I'm pleased to be able to speak and to say a few words on it. But let me also categorically state my support for the general legalized pathway as presented by the National Alliance for the Legalization of Ganja.
Minister Semuda.
You know, Mr. Speaker, consistent with our approach in these debates, it is customary for us to extend the courtesies of allowing the member to complete the presentation. However, she is known to speak for lengthy periods.
Not today.
So I would like if she could indicate.
10 minutes is sufficient.
10 minutes is good enough? So, Mr. Speaker, I ask that you allow the member to be given 15 minutes, within which time to complete her presentation.
Those in favor? Those against? Dr. Burke.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that, for the courtesy. I'm sure, no, Mr. Speaker, in the interest of time, let me place 3 other suggestions on the table as I push for a regulated recreational regime in much the same way that alcohol is regulated. 1, legalize and establish minimum standards for the local recreational market as part of a local economic development thrust, giving responsibility to the local municipal corporations for licenses to growers and retailers, and the public health department to monitor the non-use of prohibited nutrients and pesticides. Secondly, similar provisions for the edible industry to include labeling standards and registration, while the Ministry of Health regulations are put in place. The third is to license all retailers as well as license the bars and clubs to be authorized to sell properly packaged and labeled ganja or cannabis, but and byproducts. Mr. Speaker, I hope that shortly we'll have an opportunity to discuss the motion on the legalization here in the Parliament, or even better, that the government of Jamaica will begin a process towards legalization so that Jamaica too can boast, like Colorado is doing, of $1 billion in revenue, primarily from recreational use. Can you imagine the kinds of social intervention and the hope that can be inspired from spending in education, health, community building, and so much more? Game changing. Mr. Speaker, in preparation for my presentation today, I engaged a couple of individuals across various municipalities, and there were really three recurring themes. One was the need and importance for working streetlights, the issues relating to the current water crisis, and the third was the distress and disappointment of the absence of a credible plan to make our communities safe. Both the streetlights and water are areas for which most citizens hold their municipality responsible, so I wanted to look at those two. In terms of streetlights, Mr. Speaker, Southwest St. Andrew has its fair share of streetlight woes, and I am also a concerned citizen working in the area, forced to plan activities and programs around the daylight hours only to ensure the safety of residents. I am particularly concerned when any activity takes our young men or our young women walking home in the dark. I may not know what it feels like for the woman who was robbed on a major roadway, but I feel her pain. I feel it in the same way I feel the pain of the young father whose son was knocked off the bicycle on Spanish Town Road where there is no light. I hear the stories of mothers who leave work and who can't go home because it's dark. They have to stay with relatives over in Portmore or friends because they're too afraid to go home. I feel a deep sense of pain, and I can only imagine the terror when you look into the barrel of a gun of an individual who intends to rape you, knowing that there's very little chance of anyone seeing what's happening. And Mr. Speaker, these are not theoretical dead stories. These are actual reality lived by individuals in our communities. And so I speak with that pain as the stories were being recounted. I am, however, heartened to hear that their arrears have been paid and that JPSCO can now focus on repairing street lights, erecting new ones, and installing LED lamps. Well done. We have come a far way. It is. We have come a far way. Reports coming out of Portmore, though, is that the newly installed LED lights are not working. And honestly, Minister, many of us just simply want to be assured that there is a coherent system of reporting and monitoring repairs to street lights and filling the gaps where new ones are required. It is a local government responsibility. Yes. Mr. Speaker, it is unacceptable, totally unacceptable, that our main corridors are not sufficiently illuminated to make our citizens feel safe. Whether it is Sir Florida Glasspool Highway, Michael Manley Boulevard, Olympic Way, sections of Round Hill to Great River, Sandy Bay to Montpelier, Seaford Town to Berkshire, Ferris to White House to Petersfield, Tucker Main Road, and so many others. You know, once upon a time, we would fear the shadows, thinking it must be a duppy. Now we fear every sound, thinking it may be a gunman. Mr. Speaker, given the magnitude of the problem, it's important to let the public know how the repairs to streetlights will be prioritized. I can think of some communities that don't have time on their side. Too many lives will be at risk. We therefore need the finer details relating to the prioritization of the roads where these lights will be fixed or installed. Mr. Speaker, again, it's about solutions. So here are my suggestions. That the ministry and the local authorities provide a searchable list of all reported street lights and notification of repairs to be done. That the JPS could also be asked to deal with the issues of lights that are fixed and then go out of service immediately, because that is a concern. Local authorities should also engage JPS, not just on the brightness of lights, because research is now showing that the brightness of the lights is as important as the consistency of having lamps along roadways. Because in a society like ours, overrun with criminals, big patches of darkness put all of us at greater risk. Water, Mr. Speaker. We say water is life, but it seems that it's only true for a few. Whatever were the problems in 2017 when I became Member of Parliament, they have only worsened during the last 2 years. There are some who believe that this is the price we should all be willing to pay for the greater good. Maybe, but the truth is, it is unbearable for those of us who have had to find ways of coping with the dust nuisance, the chaos on the road, the risks to pedestrians and motorists alike, and to top it off, the lack of water over such a protracted time. Over the period, we have felt as if the residents and business owners or operators were not even an afterthought. Let me make it clear. I am all for development and infrastructural expansion. However, this is a classic case of mismanagement. The NAA dropped the ball on ensuring citizens were kept constantly up to date on the progress of the project, as well as the dismal traffic management system. It seems that the plans were inadequate and the implementation was even worse. Mr. Speaker, as a result, our schools, clinics, and businesses have had no water, no phone, no internet, and reduced access to their properties for months. There are many businesses that have had to reduce staff. Some are even contemplating closure. This situation is nothing short of a nightmare for families in particular. Simple chores like cooking and washing have become almost impossible. These again are real-life experiences that rob our people of their dignity and make them feel as if they're living on the margins. Our citizens deserve better. As I move my focus to look at crime, and you would notice that I'm transitioning not just on local government issues, but the issues that affect Southwestern Andrew as well. I want to thank, first of all, the men and women of the security forces who have been working in Southwestern Andrew in particular, but across the island. Yeah. You know, in the main, the majority of them really, they have been professional. They have done what they can with the resources that they have. But I get the sense that they too are tired, that they are stretched thin, and that they are in need of more resources. The team at Hunts Bay has responded to the cry of the community on every occasion. So my thanks and my heart go out to them. You know, Mr. Speaker, on July 31st, 2017, I woke up to the headlines in one of our major newspapers, and it says, Brownburg faces 48 gangs. And it read, and I quote, 48 gangs. Angela Brownburg's victory in constituency elections to replace Portia Simpson Miller in St. Andrews Southwestern will be tempered by news that the area is home to 48 gangs. The bulk of the Jamaican gangs, which police blame for the majority of murders in the island. That was the headline in our major newspaper. The first 12 months only serve to reinforce the headline. It is no secret that crime festers where social and economic conditions are less than desirable. Despite the tremendous improvement done in several communities under the stewardship of the former Member of Parliament, there is still work to be done in many areas. With that said, it has struck me that even in light of this reality, Southwest St. Andrew has still not been identified as one in need of police intervention at the highest level. Mr. Speaker, it has been a very turbulent period, waking up so many mornings with the news of the most heinous acts of violence. The men, women, and children in Southwest have been living in utter fear, with their mobility and sense of safety deeply affected by crime. Again, the stories have been horrific. I don't think I could find anything new to speak about the situation in the constituency. I can only hope that the policymakers value our lives as much as they do residents in other areas where they have decided to place ZOZOs or implement enhanced security measures. I'm equally clear that a state of emergency is neither coherent nor effective long-term crime-fighting strategy. It cannot be. It provides no long-term solution for crime. We are now at our wits' end, and I'm using this opportunity to make a plea for a different approach. We cannot continue to do the same things over and over, expecting a different result. Lest we be accused of doing what Albert Einstein cautioned us against. So let me repeat this for emphasis. At this point, I don't care what to call it. Call it state of emergency, call it ZOZO, call it YASO, DESO, SOSO, whatever you call it. The name is inconsequential. What we need is a joined-up action backed by joined-up resources from the Ministry of National Security, Education, Social Security, Local Government and Community Development, Ministry of Economic Growth and Development, Culture, Gender, all of those. And that's what we call Unite for Change, a multi-sectoral approach. We need far more boots on the ground, both visible and mobile. We need police posts at strategic points, more police youth clubs, resources to PMI for intervention, more support to SDC for local economic development, for sports, for capacity building, more resources for individual and group counseling at the community level, restorative justice programs, state resources to all ministers fraternal for their active engagement. More needs to be done. If we all need to gather see a commitment to reducing crime and having the security forces take charge of the space, then I'm certainly ready. Because to continue as we are is to condemn many more Jamaicans to die unnecessarily. This callousness from our government is totally unacceptable. The people of Southwest St. Andrew deserve better, and I am the Member of Parliament here on duty. As I close, Mr. Speaker, today I am proud to have been given the opportunity to build on the Most Honorable Portia Simpson-Miller's legacy. She is a giant of a leader, a champion of the people. I am equally proud to be partnering with individuals whose lives and sense of self have been significantly improved by the work she has done over the 40 years she was Member of Parliament. I come here every day knowing that the baton has been passed to me, ensuring I honor her in all that I do. I am leaving no one behind in Southwest St. Andrew. My approach has been to ensure we find solutions for our challenges, even within tight fiscal realities, extending equal access, opportunity, and respect to all. Mr. Speaker, I have had a lifelong passion for community development and activism. I started out as a young woman who wanted to give back to my community, and that morphed into being a local government representative. I am always mindful, therefore, that our solutions must reflect the concerns and aspirations of the Jamaican people. Over the years, we have made progress in ensuring local government has real autonomy and prominence within the governance system. But there is no doubt that we need to strengthen some initiatives and processes as municipalities bear in mind the local realities and respond to emerging development priorities. We need to act in a manner that demonstrates to our people that we care, that we understand their plight, that their lives matter, that all lives matter. Our citizens deserve knowledge. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
Well done, Andy.
Thank you.
You know, my seat gave me inspiration.
Mr. Samura. Minister Samura.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries will now respond to the member from Central Kingston on the resolution moved by him.
Minister Shaw. Remember, you're in Parliament. I don't know what holiday we have today, but it's just not going well. Please, let's keep our standards. Let's keep the standard of the Parliament. Your ear might not be hearing well. Mine is well.
Read your emotion. Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak on the motion moved by the member from Central Kingston, focusing on the agricultural sector and in particular seeking to have our support for the enhancement of training and expertise in agriculture and agro-processing skills, and to increase the access of credit of agriculture in Jamaica. I want to thank the member for his motion, and I take pleasure in responding and participating in this debate. We are not at a perfect stage, Mr. Speaker, and my intention is not to suggest that, but I want to put things into context. And I most certainly will specifically refer to the question of training, and even if I cross into my colleagues' territory of education, I will have to do that as well, because it is an important matter to deal with. So, Mr. Speaker, the member has correctly noted that agriculture is a critical benchmark if we are going to achieve growth and prosperity in the country. Because well over 200,000 Jamaicans are involved in agriculture as our small farmers. And there is no question at all that over the years they have suffered from the uncertainties of weather conditions. They have not given, in my view, the sufficient level of support that ought to be given to them. And I speak as a member of parliament who represents small farmers, right, in northeast Manchester, as indeed we have our small farmers all over the country. So I just want to broadly address some issues and then to just focus more in more detail on the specific points that the member has made. There's no question that we are at a point in agriculture in Jamaica where some would say a point of crisis, where we have a sugar industry that's in decline, a traditional industry. But you know, it is said that in every adversity there is always a seed of greater benefit. We have to find the seed, we have to sow it, and we have to get that greater benefit. What is one of the, Mr. Speaker, one of the seeds that we are sowing right now? Because we have already recognized that the 120,000 or so acres of land that has been appropriated to sugarcane is no longer sustainable. So in the first instance, Mr. Speaker, I'm to announce to this House in a more specific way today that we are taking out 60,000 acres out of that 120,000 acres to put into other areas of agricultural production. That, Mr. Speaker, is a major decision that has been made. We have to rationalize our production of sugarcane. We have to do it more efficiently, and we have to make land available to do other things. What are those other things, Mr. Speaker? And I want to let the House know that we now have hundreds of applications for use of land for agriculture other than sugarcane production. And it includes a wide range of things, including, by the way, mangoes, which were able to, after 20 years lag in exporting mangoes to the United States. Last week, Thursday, our Minister without portfolio, Mr. Hutchinson, witnessed the export of, was it 12,000? Huh? 12,000 what? 12,000 mangoes, pounds. No, 12,000. 12,000 something. Anyway, a substantial amount of mangoes. Enough mangoes, Mr. Speaker, were exported last week. And twice a week we'll be exporting mangoes until the season is over. Primarily, I think, concentrated on Julie and East Indian mangoes, which tend to be the hardier type of mangoes. And they're using a technology called irradiation, which is not as potentially destructive as the hot water treatment system that has been in use before, because that tends to hasten the ripening of the fruit, and that is not good for sustainability going into the marketplace. And the initial response, Mr. Speaker, is that the market in Florida is overwhelmed by the presence of the Jamaican mangoes. Early reports are that mangoes from the Dominican Republic and Mexico are in retreat. Because of the high quality and the taste, the natural taste of our Jamaican mangoes. And so, Mr. Speaker, we want to encourage our investors. Part of those 60,000 acres of land that will be available and that is available in St. Catherine, in Clarendon, in Trelawney, we are inviting more investment in mango orchards in Jamaica. Mango orchards, because let me say this. The licensing procedures for getting into the United States require global gap conditions. And the best way to do that is to have orchards that are produced at a certain internationally acceptable standard in how it's managed, in treatment of fruit flies and all of that. And then once that is done, the certification for export is virtually guaranteed. So we want to encourage that. And of course, there are so many other things now that are on the horizon that we need to diversify into. And I won't spend all of the time to go all into those areas now, since they have not been essentially a part of the motion. But in every crisis, there's always an opportunity. So it's not just mangoes. It's things like Sea Island cotton. It is bamboo. Bamboo is getting new life. Why? Because we ourselves have led the way to banning an abundance of plastics, right? Other countries are following suit. It's happening all over the world. There has to be a replacement for the plastics, and the bamboo is a raw material for the replacement of things like straws and paper, pardon me, because it is biodegradable. So bamboos are on the agenda again. Coconuts, a fast-growing international industry that we have the capacity for, but while the world is growing, we are either in decline or stagnating. While we have so many acres of idle lands in Jamaica where we can produce bamboo, coconuts. Our company, Grace Kennedy, as I've mentioned in this house before, they are the largest exporter of bamboo coconut products into Canada. And the raw material is not from Jamaica. It comes from Indonesia, Malaysia, elsewhere in the Far East. Unacceptable. So, Mr. Speaker, the appropriation of land to large, medium, and small farmers is well underway. And I want to say at one point here, and it's not to stir up anything, but the issue of the land distribution at Bernard Lodge is an issue that the government has had to look on in a very critical way, because ultimately, as we move on the road of development, there's going to have to be some appropriation of land depending on where it is strategically located. When you look at the Bernard Lodge lands, Mr. Speaker, what do you see? Where can you expand the Portmore area? You cannot expand to the south. It's heading for the sea. You cannot expand to the east, which is headed to the port of Kingston. And you cannot expand north because there are limitations in the expansion north. The only logical area for expansion is west. If you look at the map, that's the only logical area of expansion. So what we have to have cooler heads prevailing on this matter. And I must tell you that of the 120 farmers that are on the 6,000 acres that are appropriated for the development of a new town, among other things, and more concentrated agriculture, by the way. The thinking that the 6,500 acres is being appropriated for buildings and for development and total abolition of farming is incorrect. Of the 6,500 acres of land that will be appropriated in that project, Bernard Lodge project, only 2,500 acres of it will be used for housing, commercial buildings, new town development, etc., etc. The other 4,000 acres, Mr. Speaker, will be appropriated for agricultural purposes within the context of that total development project. I just want to make that very clear. And beyond that, another 22,000 acres of land remain in the Bernard Lodge area for further allocation to farmers who will be requesting it. So, Mr. Speaker, pardon me? Yes, so when you add the 22,000 to the 4,000 that will remain in agriculture from that development project, you're looking at 26,000 acres of land that will continue in agriculture. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to say that in terms of training, we intend in the ministry to make sure that we have an increase in training and technical assistance through the RADA, the Rural Agricultural Development Organization, Administration Agency, and BODLS, the Scientific Research Council, and the College of Agriculture, Mr. Speaker. We intend to focus on developing clean planting materials for farmers, spearheaded by BODLS by the Bodos Research Station. And we want to encourage, Mr. Speaker, local and foreign direct investors with deep pockets to join the sector, in part working to link these large investors with small farmers using the mother farm concept where they introduce technology and the appropriate capital investment to build out on the levels that we require. In terms of financing, which the member has correctly mentioned, that's an area that we're focusing on with a lot of diligence. I'm in touch with the Development Bank of Jamaica, finding ways to mitigate loan risk of up to 80% through the Development Bank of Jamaica. We have to repurpose the People's Cooperative Bank. It's been lying dormant for far too long. And the Development Bank of Jamaica is instructed to carry out a deliberate, purposeful plan to repurpose the role and function of the People's Cooperative Bank. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we are looking at other creative measures. Just this morning, I launched a program with the Jamaica Cable and Wireless Credit Union that is putting aside $2 billion on lending to small farmers across Jamaica. And we launched that project this morning. In addition to that, the Minister of Finance is aware that we have a formal study being carried out, and when the study is completed, we'll be presenting it to the Honourable Minister of Finance concerning the issue of dormant funds. As I've mentioned before, there are dormant funds in this country that remain in dormant accounts for 15 years before there's any suggestion of it returning to government coffers. The average, Mr. Speaker, is 7 years globally. The average in the United States is 5 years. In Jamaica, it is 15 years. So that alone, the stark contrast in the time frames there, itself attracted the need for a review, and that review is now formally being carried out before being presented to the Minister of Finance and the Cabinet of Jamaica for consideration. Because it's no question about it, Mr. Speaker, that our farming sector needs more concrete, low-cost funding. And they need assistance in other ways. We have to be creative. We have to think out of the box. One such thing that I'm doing now, and it's going to require possibly a trip that I will make to Korea later this year. I've been invited to a conference in Korea, I think in September. And one of the reasons I'm attracted to the idea is that I'll also be able to meet with the United Nations Green Climate Fund that is based in Korea and has funding for programs that we are putting together now. I'll give you two examples. One of them is the National Fruit Tree Planting Program that I've made mention before. The other one is an irrigation system for small farmers. That is to say, all right, you have irrigation systems for large areas, acreages of flat land. We just launched the Essex Valley scheme, supported by the British government, 35 million British pounds. We're about to launch schemes in Clarendon and St. Catherine using other money from the British government grant program, up to a total of about 55 million British pounds. But in addition to that, I am approaching the Green Climate Fund for support for small irrigation systems that can help small farmers who have quarter acre and half acre land. In Portland, St. Elizabeth, Upper Clarendon, Manchester, elsewhere, St. Elizabeth, all over, right? And what do they need? They need more help. We have a model that I launched a few months ago, weeks ago, with the Jamaica Social Investment Fund in St. Elizabeth, where small farmers get their tanks and they get their drip irrigation lines, and they are irrigating and they are planting. And I want to propagate that across the country among small farmers across the country. And that is one of the climate change initiatives that we have to adopt, and we have to approach it with a lot of zeal and a lot of alacrity. Mr. Speaker, this is, as I said, this is not meant to be a broad presentation to take too long, but I want to also point out that last year we spent a record amount of money on farm roads of $800 million. This year, $750 million, just $50 million less on farm roads for this year. And we want to make sure, let's get those roads repaired fast so that if we find a gap in the supplementary, that we can go to the finance minister for a little more support. Right? Then we will go to him, but we have to make sure we spend the first amount first. But the repair to farm roads is a critical part of this. I want to also say that we have formally applied to the Chinese government for a grant of $100 million United States dollars to help us to repair roads and open new roads in the Blue Mountain region in order for us to develop the coffee industry on a more sustained basis. So we're working on that. We're working, as I mentioned to you before, on the question of land distribution. Let me, before I mention something on education as I come down, let me also say that the key to the success of the agricultural sector has got to be having a value chain from what you grow to what you process to what you sell to the markets. And the markets cannot be Jamaica alone. The markets have to be Jamaica, your hotels, your tourists. It has to be the region, CARICOM. It has to be the diaspora markets abroad where they're crying out for Jamaican product, can't get it. It has to be third country markets that are looking for exotic things that we are producing in Jamaica, but we have not gotten onto the international marketing platform for things like spices, exotic sauces, wines, all kinds of things that we are producing. And it was so interesting, I went to tour the St. Catherine District Prison, where they have a processing food facility there, producing Jamaican unique things like wines and beers from locally produced fruits at the St. Catherine District Prison. Right now, that is taking place. And we want to commend them on the initiative and enterprise supported by the United Nations Development Program, among other people, and the government of Japan, incidentally. It's a wonderful project that I invite you to take a look at. But agro-processing, therefore, now has to be part of that value chain. Right? And we have always had the idea that, oh, when you produce the things fresh, if you can't sell it, the poor farmers suffer. That's not going to happen anymore. What you can't sell fresh, we're going to process it. We have pumpkins. If you can't sell it fresh, you have pumpkin puree. And you have it in 5-gallon cans, and you sell it to the hotels, and you sell it in the soup kitchens at the schools for the school feeding program. And so instead of importing genetically modified flour, right, and other genetically modified food, we have enough local things like pumpkin, sweet potato, cassava, breadfruit, gluten-free, by the way, that are available here. We don't know how much wealth we have in Jamaica. We have to focus on it in a more deliberate and comprehensive way. And so what I want to just remind you of, because I mentioned it before, is that a transformation is underway whereby, first of all, the AMC complex on Spanish Town Road, we have stopped that sale to the private sector, which it ran the risk of becoming yet another used car lot. The Spanish Town Road complex is going to be a public-private partnership to develop a modern agricultural processing center. The port where it can ship away and export things is 5 minutes down the road. And that is what we're going to do with it. This is where a lot of the young people who are designing things, who cry out that they have no factory space will be available at the AMC complex on Spanish Town Road. Mr. Speaker, equally, the private sector is stepping up. Grace Kennedy is setting up a processing facility in Denby. National Meats is setting up a processing facility at the old national meats, Lidford Logistics, Richard Lake, Lisa Hanna, are setting up a facility at the old national meats facility in Lidford. They're calling it Lidford Logistics. Purchase fresh things from farmers, process things, and sell it to the hotels not far away down the road on the north coast. Jam processors in Williamsfield in Manchester that exports right now 6 to 7 containers of yams per week. They now want to get into the processing of food. What they can't sell fresh, they will process it and sell it as well. And others are getting interested. Even rainforest and Caribbean producers down in Montego Bay, they are mostly importing, but now they want to get involved in the local value chain as well. So we want to let our farmers know, you grow what you have to grow. We are going to find a way, along with those private sector initiatives and the agro-parks that we have set up across the country, we're going to find a way to take from you what you're producing. And let me say one last thing on production. I'm very proud of the fact that a company like Sectoral that has entered into an engagement with Nestle to establish an international platform for the sale of dairy products. The problem is we don't have the dairy products. When I was milking cows with my daddy and carrying it up to the road before I got to high school, we were producing 60 million liters of milk per year. You know what we're down to now, Mr. Speaker? 14 million liters of milk per year. That's where we are now. And with this modern engagement between Nestle and Sectoral, with the old condensary at Bagwalk, we can go back to 60 million and we can go to 100 million liters because we have a world market to supply things that are produced right here in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, that has got to be the thinking right now in order for us to move from poverty to prosperity. In terms of education, I want to say that I've been advised by the College of Agriculture, Mr. Speaker. Agriculture is now a part, and the Ministry of Education, that agriculture is now a part of the National Standards curriculum. Very important. All students from early childhood, primary and secondary to schools will be exposed to agriculture and related disciplines. We have to bring back the school garden. I used to work in the school garden at Christiana Lee's Primary School. We have to bring back the school garden. Increasing number of students are studying agricultural science as well, Mr. Speaker. And at the College of Agriculture, they have reported to me that the Ministry of Education is providing 15 agricultural education scholarships to students at Case for 2019-20, and more are expected in the future. In September of this year, Case will begin to offer a master's degree in animal science, a bachelor's degree in agribusiness management, an associate degree in agriculture engineering technologies. And in collaboration with the Ministry of Education and the United States Aid Agency for International Development, CASE now offers 2 programs in agro-processing along with a prior bachelor's in food systems management. All of that is taking place at CASE right now. CASE has entered franchising arrangements with other tertiary institutions to expand agriculture offerings in the tertiary sector. And Mr. Speaker, in addition to overseas collaborations that the member noted, CASE will shortly sign MOUs with RADA, BODLS, and the Scientific Research Council. So we're having a granular linkage between our educational institution and the government departments that have to roll out the thing in a real way to support our farmers. I think this is significant. And research collaborations are taking place between these institutions in a number of areas, including ginger, providing clean planting material, and believe me, I know about that because our ginger industry up in northeast Manchester, northwest Clarendon, up in north Clarendon as well, been suffering from burning up, right? Roasting up in the soil. Sweet potato, producing clean planting material for farmers. Irish potato, identifying drought-tolerant varieties. Pineapples, expansion of the availability of planting material, and will seek to extend and expand its memorandum of understanding with the Hart Ebony Park program as well. Case and Bodles are in dialogue to establish a campus at Bodles to improve access to agriculture education in St. Catherine. Yes, to set up a campus down there so that it can be linked directly to the support and the research that is being given to farmers. So, Mr. Speaker, the Case Board has also approved a 5-year strategic plan with the stated goal of Case attaining university status. To assist the process, this government has facilitated the development of a brand new IT infrastructure for the college to lay the groundwork for university status, provided significant support to improve the physical infrastructure of the college, provided significant funding to construct a new tunnel ventilated chicken house to replace the 40-year existing structure, replaced all lighting fixtures to reduce the energy cost. Over the course of the next year, PCJ will assist the college to install a solar system to allow the college to come off the grid. And we have also embarked on a plan to completely redesign the wastewater treatment system for the college. So, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to make these points to indicate to the honourable member that things are not perfect, but there are strong, firm, purposeful plans that are on the way. And I think that what we have to do is we have to carefully chart our way forward and understand that in every adversity there's a seed of greater benefit. The adversity of sugar gives us the opportunity to diversify. When I went to Israel 3 months ago, and you leave the airport, a country surrounded by deserts and enemies, and to see what they have done. As you leave the precincts of the airport, you're looking at mango orchards, citrus orchards, avocado orchards. You're looking at forestry in the hills. They don't have water like us. They don't have natural rainfall like us. They extract salt from the seawater and irrigate. And now their per capita income is $40,000 US. And ours is less than $6,000 US. Let's work together. And let's be reminded of the book of Job that says, for there is hope of a tree, if it be cut down, it will sprout again. And from the tender branch thereof, it shall not cease. Jamaica and agriculture will sprout again. Thank you very much.
Mr. Jackson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just wish to make a few comments on one of the items raised by the Minister as it relates to Bernard Lodge. Mr. Speaker, the information that the Minister gave is incomplete. There are essentially two issues arising with the Bernard Lodge issue. For many years now, the water authorities and experts in the country have prohibited physical development on a number of acres of land in the Bernard Lodge Plains. And the argument is that it was critical to preserve the water reserve that serves not only the Portmore area but also the Kingston metropolitan area. And so for many years, housing development interest was rejected by NEPA consistently. As Member of Parliament in one of the constituencies in the area, many housing development interests have come and have gone. because of that critical element of preserving the water resources. The minister mentioned about the limitation for the expansion of Portmore. Mr. Speaker, development is welcomed. It's all a question of how. My colleague from Southwest St. Andrew mentioned about the Constant Spring Market, and the point that it's not what was done, it was how it was done. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the Bernard Lodge lands, it is a fact that there are many persons who have leased lands for many years and have never done anything in terms of agricultural activity. And I have always protested that situation continuing, because there have been many persons who have expressed interest to carry out farming activities in the area and just never had the opportunity. It is also of note, Mr. Speaker, that multiple millions of dollars, taxpayers' money, have been spent to develop the irrigation system in the Bernard Lodge. Millions of dollars of taxpayers' monies are invested under the ground there. It is one of the best irrigated set of lands in Jamaica, and that cannot be disputed. And then all of a sudden, we come to learn that that investment is being abandoned and housing and other development activities will take place. Another point to note, Mr. Speaker, that many of the farmers on Bernard Lodge, because the land was leased in large tracts from the then National Land Agency. Yes, Mr. Speaker, as I said, Mr. Speaker, the lands were leased in 20, 40, and 50-acre tracts. And what has happened over the years is that many smaller farmers have sort of utilized the land on a subletting arrangement. So they are not formal lessees from National Land Agency, but they are conducting farming activities. They themselves cannot make any claim, but they are legitimate farmers on the land. Mr. Speaker, I went on a tour of the area some couple of months ago, and I've taken pictures and I've shown it to my colleague from the leader of government business in the House. One of a few, just one of Mr. Lynn, who is on a 15-acre tract of land, does plants, flowers that he exports weekly, and I have pictures of it. He was told that that land that is in Block C in particular, that land has been taken away from him and given to one person. And all of that farming activities have been abandoned. The gentleman subsequently died when he was, yes? Mr. Speaker, I have learned the same gentleman, in settlement for relocation for removal of that man. The settlement for that was in the order of $30 million. Taxpayers' money, tenant. Because of his farming activities, that was the compensation. The man subsequently died. I have pictures of his farming activities I've shared with my colleague. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of other small farmers over there who have been uprooted. And what is so distasteful in my mind, Mr. Speaker, is that when I speak to SCJ about these persons who are being relocated, And you might have heard it on the news. Oh yes, nobody. No. I've recently seek to lease 20 acres of land. Yes, yes. Not in Bernard Lodge, but in Innswood. Publicly, nothing secret about it. A formal commercial transaction. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Let the facts speak for themselves. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, there are a number of small farmers that SCJ have told me they will relocate them. They will relocate them from Block C that they have taken and give to one large, one single investor. And they are relocating those same farmers. Even if they were captured, they are relocating them down south of the Phoenix Park development and lands that they are going to invest to put in infrastructure in to put the same farmers. The question I asked, Mr. Speaker, why didn't you put that new developer where you are going to relocate those small farmers? Why take them from the preferred location and push them in the corner where there's no infrastructure and only promise that you're going to put infrastructure there? That, Mr. Speaker, is what hurts. That is what hurts, Mr. Speaker. These are people who, there is one farmer there, Mr. Speaker, a young gentleman, 25 years old. He does over one plot of onion that he just started cultivating. All of that have to go. He just got a lease from Red Stripe to plant cassava for the beer manufacturing business. All of that gone up in the year. A 25-year-old farmer, entrepreneurial person, he has no future there. Mr. Speaker, after all is said, that is the reality of what is transpiring there. Mr. Speaker, the minister mentioned about the limitation of Bernard Lodge for expansion of Portmore. There are thousands of lands in the Elsha Hills, thousands of acres that can be developed for housing. We welcome those developments and whoever wants to invest. The minister without portfolio visited the area with me a few months ago. He was alarmed himself. He said, Fitz, this is where house should be built. Yeah. He saw it and said it himself. Mr. Speaker, when the Highway 2000 east-west leg was built, it was established that that corridor was up for development, housing and other development activities. There are lands in proximity to the corporate area along that corridor for development. Nothing is being done. So when I hear that, where else can Portmore be developed? Which other set of lands? It is not true. But I mentioned about the how, Mr. Speaker. What is the other issue of concern to residents of Portmore? It is a fact that Portmore developed in a very unplanned way initially. Greater Portmore development was an attempt to correct that. And many of the failings that you had in the older part of Portmore never carried over in Greater Portmore. It had a range of social infrastructure, recreational spaces, etc. All of that was in place. There was better planning there. What has been the case, Mr. Speaker, even as we speak now, is the impact of that area on the older part of Portmore. No development can take place in the proposed area without significant impact on the existing areas of Portmore. And all we are saying, if you are going to do any significant development in the area, let it be done in a planned and organized way so that the existing residents of Portmore is not made worse from the increased expansion of housing over there. Right? Right now, as we speak, Mr. Speaker, if it wasn't for great insistence, the over 2,000 houses being built would not have the infrastructure work being done between Naggerhead and and Bayside with the expansion of the road. Because left alone, they were going to build the houses without expanding that roadway. And anybody who live in Elshaw or Portmore knows the havoc traversing along that corridor going that way in the evening. And in the peak hours, with the additional houses that are coming on stream, that situation is going to be made worse. Mr. Speaker, all I'm trying to say is that when we are going to develop, it must be properly planned. And consultation must be done with the major stakeholders who are going to be affected by this activity. What is so unreasonable, Mr. Speaker, in sitting with the local authorities and the various stakeholder groups and plan together? It is their lives that are going to be affected by what takes place there. Mr. Speaker, one of the experiences that I've had over the years, even in some of the housing development, the quality of the work have left a lot to be desired. And at the end of the day, it is the elected representatives that have to bear the brunt of it. Because when the developers are gone, it is us, the elected representatives, who the people have to come to. The councillors, the members of parliament. And it's for that reason, Mr. Speaker, whatever we are doing, we must do it right at the beginning. Don't try to correct it. The amount of money spent to correct drains in Greater Portmore could have done a lot more activities over there because they weren't done properly. And we are begging and pleading that if we're going to carry out any development activities, let us work together, plan together, and do the things that are necessary to improve the quality of life of the residents, and at the end does not make it more miserable for them. So, Mr. Speaker, even at this last moment, the Prime Minister announced recently at the opening of a housing development in St. Catherine that there are going to be a review of the Bernard Lodge development. The Prime Minister said so. I read that in the media. Mr. Speaker, I have heard nothing since that announcement. And the residents that I represent have heard nothing about it. Yet, their lives will be affected by the decisions that the government take. So I'm making a plea, Mr. Speaker. I'm making a plea. Even at this last moment, let us sit down together and see how the development can enhance the quality of life for the people who live there and those who are likely to become potential new residents in the Portmore area. I make my plea, Mr. Speaker, and I beg that good sense prevail in this matter. Thank you much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Permission to speak from a seat other than mine.
Permission.
Say, Mr. Speaker, that it is important that when we speak, especially in this House, we speak factually. And the truth of the matter is that a lot of what the member said was emotive and with no substance. Absolutely no substance. And I'm going to start, Mr. Speaker, very quickly by saying that there was a no-build policy decision taken by the previous administration. The minister at the time was Minister Pickersgill, the member from... And it was for a reason. But guess what? The very government breached their own no-bill policy in that area as late as 2015, not to mention Morris Meadows and Caribbean Estates, which were built right there in the same area that we're speaking about, approved under that administration. I'm going to go further. In 2015, shut up and listen and you'll learn. Shut your mouth and listen. Mr. Speaker, I speak from a position of authority because the master plan was done by NEPA, which falls under me. SCJ falls under my colleague, Minister here, who, as you know, we work very closely. That is bad and not bad enough. In 2015, the year before they lost the election that they didn't know they were going to lose, they sold 356 acres to Gore Development Limited on the same land that they said that there's a no-build policy on. When we decided as government to pursue the sale of land for development of housing, it is the Prime Minister, the Chairman of the Cabinet, who said that he will not entertain anything until such time as a proper master plan is done. That's the origin of the Bernard Lodge master plan. So when the hypocrite stands here and tells you,
Mr. Speaker.
Hypocrite
Point of
stands here and
order.
tell you
Point of
about no
order,
bill.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Please allow.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Allow
Mr. Speaker.
Mr.
Mr. Speaker.
No, we can't be standing together.
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw the word hypocrite.
Suppose I ask you to yield
And I will tell him outside after.
for the. Oh, you withdrew. Okay.
I'll tell him to his face after. That this present administration is pursuing a development on a no-build zone. I find that disingenuous, because the bottom line is that the facts speak for themselves in relation to the no-build and what took place in that same very area. That's point number one. Point number two, Mr. Speaker. Everything that we are doing is guided by the input of the necessary agencies of government. And just yesterday, the enterprise team, which was established for the implementation of the master plan, came to Cabinet to make a presentation based on the Prime Minister's comments of a review. That was done, and certain instructions were given. And in due course, when the Prime Minister is satisfied of all that he wanted to find out yesterday, he will come back to this honorable house, or wherever he so desires, to make that statement. Let me go further now, Mr. Speaker. You talk about consultation. You talk about consultation. Let me categorically state that between my colleague minister and myself, the two ministries, there were certain directives given to the SCJ, and that was that any farmer who was to be affected is to be relocated and compensated if it is that that particular parcel of land falls into the urban development area. And I'm going to repeat, out of the 6,500 acres, 2,500 is for urban development and 4,000 is for agriculture. So in the master plan itself, there still is 2-to-1 use for agriculture. There are many people, Mr. Speaker, that have leases that either are in default for non-payment or in breach for leasing or subletting these parcels of land without the permission of the SCJ. So, Mr. Speaker, what you have is a man who has acquired a lease. And I won't tell you when he acquired the lease, because I'm not going to play that game today. But he's not a farmer. So what he has done now is become a landlord. Because what he has done is take the 20 or the 30 or the 50 acres and sublet it to 5 or 10 farmers to grow and collect the rent or the lease payment at the end of the time. So we are correcting that, Mr. Speaker, because I'm going to go a step further. The instruction was also given that if there is somebody who is there without proper tenure, they are to be treated the same way in terms of finding a parcel of land, to give them an opportunity to have a proper lease and to do business in the right and proper way, because that's how we do things over this side. So there will be no farmer, whether he is in good stead with the SCJ or he's in default, that will not get an opportunity to be able to continue. I'm going to go a step further, because a lot has been said that is erroneous. Those persons who have crops in the ground will get the necessary time to reap those crops. And that's a part of any divestment of land. So if it is cash crops and it takes 6 months or 9 months, they will be allowed to. Where it is that they have trees that cannot be transplanted, then that is where the necessary compensation goes or comes into effect. So, Mr. Speaker, this narrative that this particular member of parliament for the area has been speaking about and doing his regular tours and sending a narrative that this whole thing is not properly thought out and it is only connected people. Most of those persons will benefit, Mr. Speaker, because those big investors that are coming to do the 100 and 200 acres are going to make sure that they act as a mother farm and taking those 20 or 30 persons or 40 or 50 in and around the area and help them in terms of being able to clear their land, help them with the inputs that they need that they can't afford, and that's why they pinker with a 1 acre and a 2 acre. And they will become prosperous, which is what we want for everybody in Jamaica. So, Mr. Speaker, let me just put it plain and straight. I am asking that the member desist from speaking without or deliberately to mislead, and to close by saying that so far the discussions and the negotiations with the farmers, albeit 4 or 5 who are completely resisting, we are making progress to come up with amicable solutions, case by case, to make sure that we look out and take everybody into consideration in this plan that is going to benefit the entire area and Jamaica by extension. Mr. Speaker, I want to make it clear that the Prime Minister gave a commitment that he was reviewing. There are some people, like my member on the other side, who is hoping to hear that the review has put a halt to this well thought out project. I can say with all confidence from where I sit that we are where I stand today, that we are going to not only move forward, but we are going to take on board the consultations that we have had. And to indicate, Mr. Speaker, again, when he says there's no consultation, the Portmore municipality is a part of the enterprise team. They are invited and have a seat at the table. So is the Spanish Town Municipal Council. So is the WRA. So is the NWA. So is the NIC and every other critical government agency. So when he gives this narrative that we're going ahead without no consultation, so much so, Mr. Speaker, that we made a presentation to the Jamaica Agricultural Society 2 weeks ago. And when he saw the presentation, he admitted to me that he was completely misled because he had no idea that this was going to happen. And on top of which, the amount of proportion land for agriculture. And most importantly, Mr. Speaker, why he was so impressed is because the cabinet submission that approved this master plan was with a caveat suggested by the Land Utilization Commission, which falls under the Ministry of Agriculture that deals with change of use. That stipulated in the cabinet submission that was approved that there would be no more change of use for land in that area except for this particular parcel of land that is now what we call the Bernard Lodge Master Plan.
Most of the people have agreed.
And, well, I won't go into that. I won't go into that. What I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that I only hope that the input that I've given here today will actually educate those persons who are watching the TV when the member goes on his regular three-man tour. Yes? To spread misleading information. And he has the ability to get information because his Portmore Municipal Council, which is controlled by his party, and the mayor is well aware of what is taking place, has put in their inputs as it relates to their concern about water and sewage, and yet still the member comes here and states these things without any, or I should say, knowing that he is not communicating the right information. So I say, Mr. Speaker, that if there's anybody who is in here or will hear or see this, you can rest assured that information is available. I can be contacted personally, the minister or any one of the agencies. And as we speak, the WRA is fully in agreement with conditionalities as it relates to how we develop the land. So I hope that that has helped, and we will hear no more misleading and disingenuous information. Thank you very much.
Order, please.
Mr. Speaker.
Go ahead, Dr. Ferguson.
Mr. Speaker, the motion before this Honourable House, motion number 5, which speaks essentially to the question of growth in the agriculture sector and the access to credit as critical points and as it relates to training within the sector. The Minister of Agriculture in his presentation spoke to a number of issues that gave an impression that all is well, although he would have, spoken in a way that honestly would say there are some issues. But a number of announcements were made. Many of those announcements we have heard before. But I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that agriculture is in crisis. Let me begin there. If you look at agriculture today in Jamaica, in the context of sugar, coffee, cocoa, the issues as it relates to human capital, the issues as relate to food security, it is very clear to me as opposition spokesman, larceny, etc. It is very clear that we have some serious problems. If you talk, Mr. Speaker, to people on the ground, the farmers and institutional leaders, it is also clear, and we have the minister without portfolio for agriculture in the House. Where we are now, if we see
agriculture as a critical plank in the overall growth strategy. Mr. Speaker, if you look at 2016, when the sector grew by 13.5%, in 2016, the sector contributed 7.3% to GDP. But then, Mr. Speaker, in 2017, we were seeing negative growth, almost 3.8% negative growth in 2017. I want to make the point, Mr. Speaker, because I'm going to be speaking in the sectoral debate, but just for the purposes of what we have said. The issues that we face if we are to experience growth in the sector. One, we have to seriously treat with human capital development in the sector. 82% of our farmers basic primary school education. And therefore, I heard the minister as it relates to the role of CASE, other institutions of learning, and the role we have to play if we are to get not just production, but productivity within the sector. Mr. Speaker, 60% of what we eat now, we import. 60% of what we eat now, we import it. Mr. Speaker, the FAO, having done a study, has shown that within the Caribbean, we lose 50% of what we produce on the farms to post-harvest loss. So all of these are critical issues if we are to talk about the prosperity that is being mooted. The question of lands, Mr. Speaker. The member from South St. Catherine raised some issues about land in Bernard Lodge. But there are issues related to land right across the country. Right across the country. And the member from West Portland believes that the method to use is once you raise any issue, you can bully down members in this house. Oh, you mean no? You think him can talk to me the way he talk to the chairman of the party? You believe him can talk to me the way that? Him can't. And if him try it, it's a different thing. What I am saying, Mr. Speaker, he's sitting here and allowing. Generations ago, you could talk to people that way. Look and talk to them. You can't come and try that with me. I am saying, Mr. Speaker, the issues Mr. Speaker,
order please, order please.
The issues related to land. What the opposition is saying is that whatever we are doing in relation to whether it is the leasing of sugar lands or the sale of lands, the opposition is asking for equity, transparency, and openness. That is what we are asking for. The minister spoke about infrastructure in terms of road. Last year, 800 million. This year, 750 million. 750 million. What the opposition is asking for, Mr. Speaker, is not to say we have spent more in recent times on roads, farm roads. But we are saying that the process
must be equitable, it must be open, and it must be transparent. Because I've had members of parliament on this side who have brought, I have a letter here, Mr. Speaker, from the member of parliament from North East St. Elizabeth in relation to farm roads. And what it involved, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that yes, 750 million will be spent, but how it will be spent among the 63 members of parliament, or even more so the rural members of parliament, is something that the opposition is watching closely. What has been happening, Mr. Speaker? Persons, councillors have been getting roads without members of parliament knowing or being aware. These are issues we're talking about. So I don't have a problem, Mr. Speaker, with more money being spent. It's how it is being spent. And I am saying that in the present situation, what we want to see in relation to access, especially with our young farmers, access to credit, access to land, access to marketing, these are issues of moment that the opposition is concerned about. But we are not going to sit here. Cocoa, the cabinet approved $700 million to deal with the frosty pod disease. Last year we got 200 million. We're not seeing any funds. And we are still saying, Mr. Speaker, the critical parishes like Clarendon that produce 65% of cocoa, no money is being spent there. We're looking at St. Mary, places like Richmond, no money is being spent. While at the same time in Richmond and in Morgan Pass in Clarendon, persons are faced with asbestos pipes and all that kind of thing in our fermentary. All I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is that I will develop on these points in my presentation. But I don't want the minister to come to this house and to give the impression by the announcements that are not repeated announcements that all is being well. The 4-H clubs, and rather, Mr. Minister, with our portfolio, nervous right now because they are of the view that they might be dismantled. 4-H club, founded in 1940. JS, 1895, also having issues. And I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, where we are now, the opposition will be monitoring closely what takes place and how, in keeping with the motion, we will have greater access to credit, especially for our young farmers, greater access to agriculture, education, greater access to research and development with technology as a major push. And we are watching keenly overall what is the growth strategy for agriculture. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well done. Thank you. Thank you for taking
Mr. Sir.
Mr. Speaker, I stand in support of the resolution moved by a member from Central Kingston. Mr. Speaker, the resolution speaks in part about the insufficient opportunities for articulation and training towards profitable agricultural sector. It also speaks to the enhancing of training and expertise in agriculture and agro-processing skills. and to increase access of credit to agriculture in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, this resolution is even more important as we celebrate Sustainable Gastronomy Day, which emphasizes the need to focus our attention on the importance of food sustainable development. Mr. Speaker, recent PIOJ report has shown that agriculture provides approximately 7% of our GDP. Mr. Speaker, while this is good, we can still do much better. And if the truth be told, our country should be able to double this 7%, which has been presented to the country by the PIOJ. But Mr. Speaker, there must be the political will to do so. When we traverse the length and breadth of Jamaica and see the hectares of land lying bare and unproductive, you say to yourself, why is this so? When we know that if we are able to feed ourselves, we will be self-sufficient and will spend less foreign exchange on the importation of food. As we currently spend $1 billion on imported food items, whether it's for or the local economy. Mr. Speaker, the agro-park some years ago played a fundamental role in having a large number of our farmers honing their skills in concentrated areas and producing crops in abundance. In recent times, Mr. Speaker, it does not appear that much attention is being paid to these parks. In my own constituency of South Manchester, the Duff House New Forest Agro Park is but a shadow of itself. The farmers produce crops in abundance with little or no markets, leaving crops to decay in the fields. Sorry that the minister has left because he spoke about the plane taking in the tourists and also taking in the food, while food are left to spoil in the field. Mr. Speaker, we are now in the mango season, and it is frightening to see the amount of mangoes which go to waste. Minister Arnold spoke about puree, and nothing has happened since then. We are only having talk. We have not seen the production. Mr. Speaker, this is where agro-processing comes in and will provide significant value added to these crops. Mr. Speaker, one of my farmers in the Duff House New Forest Agro Park, a very enterprising farmer, Oswald Bent, has done his due diligence with the Scientific Research Council, the Bureau of Standards, the Jamaica Business Development Company, and has been producing value-added products such as herbal thyme. Here it is, herbal thyme tea that he has been producing, whether he goes to Twickenham Park or he goes into Santa Cruz. And these are caffeine-free. He has also produced, Mr. Minister, Mr. Speaker, dried thyme, dried escallion, and we believe that much more can be done. He needs to get the support by having the agro-park equipped with, it's never too late. It's never too late. So we need to have it going. Mr. Speaker, it cannot be beyond the government to look at equipping the facility and other facilities at the various agro-parks to enable our farmers to maximize their potential or even to break even. With tomatoes being sold at $10 per pound and escallion at $15 per pound, I ask what can be done to assist our farmers across our country. The Minister of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries admitted some months ago, as reported in the Daily Gleaner on January 9, 2019, that school children are being fed a steady diet of genetically modified foods with the full knowledge of the state, exposing them to potentially nutritional deficiencies and in the process marginalizing local farmers. The minister further posited that we can produce foods that are of higher nutritional value, whether it is pumpkin, sweet potato, gluten-free cassava, and breadfruit for the school feeding program, which is indeed a great idea and will be a good investment for the Jamaican farmers. We await these things to come in stream, and the school feeding program would do better than having genetically modified foods for our children. Mr. Speaker, the member from Central Kingston, speaking on the motion, said that on a visit to agricultural school, students were asking that the school provides additional auxiliary workers to tend to the farms while they stay in bed. How can this be, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, every school from the early childhood level should begin some agricultural practices. Gone are the days when children had to tie out the goats, feed the chickens, and look the rabbit feeding before going to school. And so many of us grew up knowing that we can produce our own food, and we all inculcated these sound values as we grow into adults. Mr. Speaker, the provision of cheaper credit for agriculture must be looked at seriously. Our farmers are crying out for this. Chemicals, seeds, and fertilizer must be made available at subsidized rates to our farmers if we are to promote national food security. The Minister of Tourism, in his message on this World Gastronomy Day, has highlighted the linkages between our agriculture and gastronomy sectors in fueling local economy. I ask, therefore, that the government look seriously at these linkages, assist the farmers with cheaper credits so that they can enhance their productivity across the country. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to support the motion moved by the member from Central Kingston, and just want to make a few comments in support of it. You see, Mr. Speaker, my contribution will be primarily about the contribution of youth in agriculture. Too often, Mr. Speaker, we have been paying lip service to youth in agriculture. And I think it is time that this country gives proper policies and direction to encourage the youth in agriculture. Mr. Speaker, it is all well and good that we speak to the advancement of these tertiary educations for agriculture, institutions for agriculture, Case, Nakalva, Elim, you name it, and produce graduates. But when they leave school, Mr. Speaker, a significant number of them cannot find jobs. They cannot go directly into the agricultural sector in terms of making agriculture something that they have been studying for 3 or 4 years to make it a business and a livelihood after that. And I think it is time that the government looks at putting these young people, instead of talking about youth in agriculture day after day, year after year. One of the things that needs to be done, Mr. Speaker, is to encourage by proper policy, by proper implementation of these policies, to get the youth into agriculture. What do I mean by this, Mr. Speaker? I think part of what needs to happen as a policy going forward, Minister Hutchinson, is for reorganization of RADA. RADA needs to be more farmer-friendly. RADA needs to be able to be an institution where these young people, after graduating from a tertiary institution or a post-secondary institution, can go to RADA and RADA say, okay, what is it that you're interested in? Let me put you to the areas, to the financial institutions that provide capital, so that we can have a process where they will not be fearful of going to the traditional banks and say, okay, I am going to go into agriculture. And you know, Minister, that the banks are fearful of giving loans to new farmers because they have to protect their shareholders' money. What the government needs to do is to find an appropriate avenue to get these linkages where these young farmers, young graduates of school who are interested in farming, who are interested in making a business of farming, get the appropriate capital so they can develop on what they have learned in school. Mr. Speaker, there needs to be a special interest rate for these young farmers who want to get into the production and agro-processing of what they produce. We cannot depend on them if we want to boost agriculture and make it more than the 7% that is contributing to GDP, to just leave them on their own. There has to be some structured way, Minister, where they can get into these financial institutions, whether it's by government taking the lead, government giving the direction, but there has to be a process where this has to be. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we need to free up those idle lands that are all about the country. In my parish, in my constituency, there's a lot of government land that is still tied up, not being productive. What we need to do, yes, what we need to do, Mr. Speaker, is to put a significant portion of this land aside for those young farmers. Because, you know, Mr. Speaker, it's all well and good these big farming conglomerates and entities get into agriculture. But the backbone of agriculture in this country was the small farmers, the small subsistence farmers on the hillsides. We are trying to get rid of that. But what we need to do is to encourage a new wave, a new breed of farmers, the young graduates from these agricultural institutions, to get involved in the business of farming. And we need to set the right environment for them to flourish in this, Mr. Speaker. So in making these brief comments, Mr. Speaker, I think if we want agriculture to be the future growth child of this country, we need to encourage those young farmers from now, give them the right incentives, and allow them to produce. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hey, Nigel, find some money.
You're going to close. Go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank all those who contributed to this debate. All but one were very well considered speeches. And I'm grateful for the expansiveness of the coverage of this resolution. Mr. Speaker, I bring this resolution and the others in my name in order to provoke discussion at the highest level in the society of issues to do with our policies towards the benefit of our people, which generally do not get the breadth of discussion that I think Parliament deserves to contribute in this regard. I'm particularly appreciative of the care that the Minister of Agriculture showed in his response to the resolution. But there are some specific things that I would enjoin on him and fully recommend to the country. He mentioned the potential of the coconut industry, Mr. Speaker, and he's perfectly correct. Some 70 million coconut trees in Indonesia and Malaysia and other Pacific countries will go out of production in the next 5 years. Jamaica has, by virtue of its proximity to a major market, as well as our equable climate, the opportunity to engage in the replacement of the product from those trees. But, Mr. Speaker, when I want to plant 10 acres of coconuts a year, I can't get the seedlings, and yet the Coconut Industry Board is flush with money. Now, science and the perils of diseases have something to do with it, but it is absolutely important that a clear way be set for the provision of large quantities of seedlings in order that the industry, with all of its potential, in which the Minister and the government recognize, in fact, becomes more than a pipe dream. That is the reality. All of the other thoughts about further processing are perfectly fine if you have the raw material. And you can't plant or reap coconuts unless you plant good seedlings. No, but I have lots of grandchildren. Yes, it is, but it's worthwhile, indeed. I'm very pleased to hear, Mr. Speaker, of the developments at Bodles. Mr. Speaker, have you been to Bodles recently? Mr. Speaker, Bodles is a terribly run-down place, and it used to be an instance, a location of high-quality research, and I'm hoping that the restoration of that will happen before the Advent. And Mr. Speaker, the Minister spoke about a campus of the College of Agriculture, soon to be the university, happily, at Bodles. Let us think of integrating it with the Heart Academy at Ebony Park, which in fact is a very fine institution and does pre-university work. So I put that for his consideration. You know, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that I raised in my opening, which wasn't taken up by the Honourable Minister, or anyone else for that matter, is the question of land titling, which has a very, very important link with agricultural production. And I'm hoping that the government will accelerate the use of the Special Provisions Act, declare all of Jamaica as appropriate areas for its utilization, and continue to issue titles to persons who have been in possession, who can show some reasonable route, without the enormous obstacles that presently exist. One limb of the resolution had to do with the availability of agricultural credit. And despite whatever plan is there for the Development Bank of Jamaica to establish some guarantee for bank credit, Mr. Speaker, that can't work unless you have some security. And the security must be registered title. And we have the legislative capacity in place to ensure that that happens. And that is a real revolution towards agricultural credit that will provide the opportunity for employment in a sustained basis that the member for Central St. Mary just aptly spoke of. These are the things that we can do. They are within our power, and they don't require any great expenditure of funds. They require the facilitation and the removal of humbug in order that the agricultural sector and the agro-processing sector may soar above the 13 or 14% of GDP that it presently anemically offers us. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm suggesting that the issue of titling be given the prominence that it requires, it deserves, in order to achieve the objectives of this resolution. There are a couple more comments that I'd like to make. First of all, I long for some specific plans as to the inclusion of more local production in the school feeding program. And I commend to the Minister in charge of Education at this time the particular use of local produce in order to provide breakfast for our school children. Lunch alone doesn't work, sir. Half of our children need breakfast. And the member for Northwestern St. Elizabeth has excellent example over time of what improvement in attendance and in educational outcomes can take place if only we will provide proper breakfast material, which can be done at the local level. Yes, if we are really firm in our policy to this. This should happen this September, Mr. Speaker, not delayed at all. I'm remembering the tremendous efforts and productivity of the yam farmers, particularly in parts of Trelawney. And I know the member for South Trelawney is in agreement with this. Mr. Speaker, that area, it may fall outside of the cockpit country, narrowly defined, but it should never be torn up in order to take away bauxite and therefore decimate the yam culture, which is earning us over $30 million a year and provides a backbone to the social organization of the peasantry in Jamaica. Let us make sure, whatever we do with other parcels of land, that we do not decimate areas which the economic exploitation of is both short-term and short-sighted and has social consequences, the likes of which we do not properly estimate when we make these plans and issue those leases. You know, the member from St. Thomas spoke about the very extensive levels of imported food. You know a policy that I would urge, Mr. Speaker? If you want to import a particular product that can be produced in Jamaica, then you must make a commitment to produce some. Invest in the local industry. Make that contingent on your capacity to get an import license for what should be a diminishing quantity of the nation's needs. You must tie the obvious value of your imports, whether it is chicken neck and back or whether it is vegetables, to your productive capacity and your willingness to invest in the nation's productivity. Otherwise, you're not sincere. You're a journeyman who is not interested in anything but your own ego. So, Mr. Speaker, I am hoping that we can see in various aspects of production, of policy, the aspirations of this resolution, and I trust that it will not be as long as it has been in the past for us to have continuing discussions on how well we are advancing in the areas of agricultural education and in the areas of proper provisions of credit. And I end reminding this House that the facilitation of titling is an absolutely fundamental and essential aspect of social peace and economic enablement. And I thank you for your indulgence. Mr. Speaker, may I put this motion to the House for the approval of the House?
Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to introduce the debate on the bill entitled An Act to Amend the Income Tax Act to provide for an increase in the personal income tax threshold, to provide for an initial allowance on capital expenditure in respect of the purchase for renovation of industrial buildings, to give permanent effect to the matters previously effected provisionally, and for connected matters which may be cited as the Income Tax Amendment Act 2019, which was tabled in this House on the 28th of May 2019. Mr. Speaker, the amendments being proposed to the Income Tax Act are in respect of 1. A 20% initial allowance on capital expenditure in respect of the purchase for renovation of industrial buildings or structures occupied for the purposes of a trade carried on by the owner, and 2. The increase in the personal income tax threshold. Mr. Speaker, by way of the Fiscal Incentives Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2013, the Income Tax Act, which is a principal act of this bill, was amended to remove the initial allowance on capital expenditure by owners on the purchase of buildings and structures that are to be used as industrial buildings or structures occupied by the owner for use in trade carried on by him. However, it was subsequently proposed that the Income Tax Act should be amended to reflect the new policy directive that is that the 20% initial allowance should be granted on the purchase for renovation of buildings and structures that are to be used as industrial buildings or structures occupied by the owner for use in trade carried on by him, and that the initial allowance must only be made to the owner if upon the purchase for renovation it is brought into use as an industrial building or structure during the first 4 years of assessment. Mr. Speaker, the policy further provides that the initial allowance given to an owner can be recovered under the following circumstances. That is, if at the end of the 4th year of assessment, the building or structure is not in use as an industrial building or structure for the purposes of a trade carried on by the owner, or 2, the renovation is not completed within the first 4 years, or 3, that a capital expenditure incurred in relation to the renovation is less than 80% of the purchase cost of the building or structure. Mr. Speaker, this amendment to the Income Tax Act is expected to encourage investment and to stimulate development and growth. As it exists today, this initial allowance is allowed for new building, but with the number of older structures that we have in Kingston, without this change, the environment is biased towards sort of starting things from the ground up as opposed to taking existing structures and renovating them. And we seek to achieve a more equitable balance between the two modes of development. So that the reintroduction, Mr. Speaker, of the initial allowance granted on capital expenditure on the purchase or renovation of an industrial building or structure will encourage the purchase, renovation, and retrofitting of buildings and structures that have become derelict or have fallen into disuse. Mr. Speaker, the amendments to the Income Tax Act in relation to the increase in the personal income tax threshold came about as a result of the 2016-2017 revenue measures. A proposal was made to increase the personal income tax threshold to $1.5 million and $96, which was implemented in two phases, from $592,800 to $1,272,000, which took effect on July 1st, 2016, and from $1,272,000 to $1,596, which took effect on April 1st, 2017, the so-called 1.5. This measure, Mr. Speaker, was recommended on the basis of alleviating economic hardship that is experienced by PAYE earners, and not only PAYE earners, earners below that particular threshold, as well as to provide low-income earners with additional disposable income to increase the incentive to work and to align those incentives towards the greater good. Part of this measure was also in respect of an increase in the income tax rate from 25% to 30% for individuals whose statutory income was in excess of $6 million. The increase in the income tax threshold was implemented on July 1st, 2016 by way of a provisional order pursuant to Section 3, subsection 1 of the Provisional Collection of Tax Act, the Act. Pursuant to the Act, the order was confirmed with modifications and extended for a further 3-month period. However, since the period of confirmation with modification and extension, the order lapsed and the collection of tax needs to be validated. It is further proposed that the government and all those persons who acted in good faith on behalf of the government in the collection of the tax be indemnified from July 1st, 2016 and ending on the commencement date of the amendment of the Income Tax Act. Now I speak about an overview of the bill, Mr. Speaker. The Income Tax Amendment Bill seeks to amend sections 13, 30, 67, and 68 of the Income Tax Act in relation to the increase in the personal income tax threshold, and the first schedule, parts 1 and 2 of the Income Tax Act in relation to the 20% initial allowance on capital expenditure. Mr. Speaker and colleagues, I will now share the main amendments of this bill. Clause 2 amends Section 13 of the Principal Act regarding deductions allowed. Mr. Speaker, a provision was inserted to state that expenses and disbursements shall only be deducted in respect of the 6-month period in which they were actually incurred. This is to clarify that the expenses and disbursements should not take effect for the entire year, as the first round of the increase in the threshold only took effect for half a year on the 1st of July 2016. Mr. Speaker, Clause 3 amends Section 30 of the Principal Act regarding the rate of income tax. The new nil rates and the respective income tax rates for the year of assessment are inserted into the section. Clause 4, Mr. Speaker, amends Section 67, subsection 7, subsection A of the Principal Act regarding returns. The new threshold amounts for the respective years of assessment are inserted. Mr. Speaker, Section 68 of the Principal Act regarding notice of income has been amended by Clause 5. In subsection A, the marginal note was inserted with a new nil rate for the year 2016. In subsection B, the new nil rates are inserted. Clause 6 of the bill updates parts 1 and 2 to reflect the policy with a new insertion of purchase for renovation. In part 2, a new subparagraph was inserted to state that the initial allowance in relation to the purchase for renovation shall only be made to the owner if the building or structure is brought into use as an industrial building or structure during the first 4 years of assessment. Mr. Speaker, in keeping with the policy intent, new insertions were made to state the circumstances under which the initial allowance would be recovered, which are: A, at the end of the 4th year of assessment, if the building or structure is not in use as an industrial building or structure for the purpose of a trade carried on by the owner, or B, the renovation is not completed within the first 4 years, or C, the capital expenditure incurred in the renovation is less than 80% of the purchase cost of the building or structure. Mr. Speaker, the bill also contains a validation and indemnity clause regarding the lapse provisional order, which brought about the increase in the personal income tax threshold. Mr. Speaker and colleagues, as you are aware, one of the ways in which validation and indemnification become necessary is in circumstances where provisional orders have lapsed. According to the Provisional Collection of Tax Act, the life of an order has 9 months. If during this time period the provisional order is not enacted into permanent law, then the order has no legal effect and is therefore null and void. Consequently, pursuant to Section 4, subsection 2 of the Act, any money paid in pursuance of that order shall be repaid or made good, and any deduction made in pursuance of that order shall be deemed to be an unauthorized deduction. Ideally, Mr. Speaker, validation and indemnification are not desirable, and as we have discussed in this House, and I have stated, Mr. Speaker, and we need to do something about that going forward. It's a fact that instances exist, and as the person with responsibility for finance, it is my duty and job to bring those that exist to the Honourable House. But we have to work on and there are others that exist, but we're going to have to work on a long-term solution to this problem. In the case of the increase in the personal income tax threshold, it is a benefit to taxpayers and not a burden, whereby government is taking money from them. However, notwithstanding this, validation and indemnification has to be done, even though the increase in the personal income tax threshold is a benefit. This is so as a provisional order, which is a temporary law, expired before the permanent law was enacted. There are other examples of provisional orders that have been validated during the last 4 fiscal years: property tax, income tax, GCT, telephone call tax, etc. Please note, Mr. Speaker, that there are, as I mentioned earlier, there are other provisional orders that need to be made permanent, them having lapsed, and some of them relate to periods long ago. But I'm as much as possible going to do as much catch-up as can reasonably be done. Mr. Speaker, the Memorandum of Objects and Reasons indicates, among other things, that a decision has been taken to amend the Income Tax Act, 1, to give permanent effect to the terms of the Provisional Collection of Tax, Income Tax number 2, and secondly, to encourage the purchase, renovation, and retrofitting of industrial buildings and structures that have become derelict or have fallen into disuse through the provision of an initial allowance, and 3, to validate and confirm as lawful the imposition and collection of personal income tax under the Income Tax Act pursuant to the Provisional Collection of Tax, Income Tax number 2 order. Mr. Speaker, I ask that this Honourable House to give due consideration to the passing of this, the Income Tax Act Amendment Act 2019.
Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as part of the comprehensive reform of incentives that took place in 2014, the first schedule to the Income Tax Act was amended to introduce more wide-ranging capital allowances for investors, including expenditures to do with research and development and so on. This provision in relation to industrial buildings and structures had existed previously, but it was somewhat modernized in the 2013-14 amendment. Now, what we are doing here is to further adjust that, to tweak that, so as to allow the capital allowance to be claimed on the expenditure to purchase these buildings, subject to conditions as set out in the bill. And we support that initiative. It is consistent with the overall policy of the provision, and as I think the Minister has indicated, it provides an additional incentive for persons to go and buy dilapidated or other structures that are not in peak condition and fix them up, and allows them to claim, or will allow them to claim, the 20% initial allowance on that expenditure. So we support that. I would only say that I think perhaps the opportunity could have been used to look at the definition of industrial building or structure in paragraph 5 of part 2 of the first schedule. That definition was amended in 2013 by the act of which I speak, the 2013 amendment to the Income Tax Act, by the Fiscal Incentives Act. But when one looks at the list, you see, for example, there's a continuing reference to an industrial building or structure, meaning a building or structure in use for the purposes of being used as a building located in a free zone, as defined in Section 2 of the Jamaica Free Zones Act. Of course, we have repealed that. We now have a new regime around the special economic zone legislation, and I think we ought to consider modernizing the reference there so that investors who purchase property with buildings that are going to be renovated and used as a SEZ, subject to the licensing regime of that act, would be able to benefit from this provision. And also the range of activities which were largely goods-based and manufacturing-based activities in the original provision. It was expanded to include some services in the 2013 amendment, but for example, it doesn't clearly encompass BPO services, knowledge process outsourcing services, the sort of services that are increasingly attracting investment. And I think maybe we could look at encouraging investors to buy buildings that need to be fixed up to, and we've seen that happen with the Central Sorting Office building on South Camp Road and so on, which I think you are familiar with that one. So yeah, it's an idea which I think we could consider looking at. In the bill itself, I wasn't quite sure how the regime works. It sounds to me, when you read it, that if you buy the building, or if you own it and you are spending money on renovating it, then you're entitled to, as the owner, the owner who incurs the capital expenditure for a trade carried on by that owner. So the owner has to be in business and using the building for his own trade. And if that is the case, and it's this expenditure attracts this initial allowance of 20% in the basis year for which the expenditure was incurred. And I see an amendment sheet. Yeah, no, it's just been circulated. Did you mention it in your opening? Yeah, sorry, I didn't. So that's why I'm embarking on this, because I didn't know you were going to deal with it. Yes. All right. Well, I think you've already captured the points which were pointed out a couple of weeks ago. So I don't need to go any further on that. All right. Good. The only other points I would make on this, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister has pointed it out. It's in a sense troubling that a revenue measure as prominent as the 1.5 introduced by a provisional order in 2016 is only now, 3 years later, being legislated in the proper way. And the interim measures that were put in place were allowed to lapse so that the provisional orders are no longer valid and the tax collected under them isn't validly collected, and hence we have to validate the collection of that tax in just a period of 3 years. And you know, we have a problem. We use these provisional orders because of the flexibility that and the efficiency with which you can introduce a measure. So the minister announcing revenue measures, or whether they be to collect taxes or give away taxes, in his budget presentation can, by virtue of the order, have it take effect on April 1. So it's highly desirable. But because it is not legislation, primary legislation, it is the scheme of the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act is very rigid around how long it can last, what has to happen for it to be validated, and so on, because it contemplates an efficient legislative process that will implement these measures properly in a relatively efficient short period of time and time again. And this spans administrations. We're caught short, so to speak, and then we have to validate taxes that were collected under expired orders. And the problem with that, of course, is it can create all sorts of legal problems because, for example, if a suit has been filed by a taxpayer who claims that taxes which he has paid in the interim under expired order are not validly collected from him, and he's entitled to have that paid back, a restitution of those monies, and then the validation bill is enacted while that suit is subsisting, the whole question of the constitutionality of the validation could be an issue. So, you know, we need to, this I think, Minister, it's very technical, boring. I'm sure it's not of any interest to most of us in here, but it is potentially a huge issue fiscally. And it's really a massive fiscal risk. It's a legal risk which impacts us fiscally. So we need to look at how we can solve this once and for all. And you would have my full support in the design of any solution if you ask for my input, because I've seen this as a problem for some time. And the last point I would make, Minister, relates to the GCT. And we had exchanged some correspondence by email in April, where I had brought to your attention that the adjustment that you graciously agreed to in your budget presentation, which I had suggested, to permit persons who were traders whose sales are less than the new threshold of 10 million, but chose to register because they feel they can handle the administrative burden of being a registered taxpayer and want to be able to claim their input tax by charging GCT on their output, should be facilitated. And 2 months ago you indicated that the advice you'd received said that it couldn't be done by a provisional order and that it would have to be legislated, and the process has started and it would be concluded soon. I'm just urging you to expedite it because there are people out there, we get reports of persons who are facing difficulties because of it. So I hope that can be done in short order so we can have, and it's a relatively easy legislative exercise. It's not a big deal to do it. And you have another Provisional Collection of Tax Act order here to do with the asset tax. Yeah, we'll save another. I noticed that you're deleting in that the definition of unregulated company, even though the order refers to it. So I'm not sure why we're doing that, but maybe I'm sure there's an explanation. So, Minister, and I'm glad you've taken on board the proposed amendments, and the bill has our support. Thank you.
Thank you. Just rising to close debate on this bill, and to thank the member for his contribution and for discussion outside of this debate that would have led to some of these amendments that are here. We do have an issue with this practice of provisional tax orders being used to implement on April 1st changes in our tax system, and then having those lapse. And we do have some historical issues to deal with, which I'll make every effort to deal with, while at the same time trying to ensure that none of the existing ones fall into this problem. That's the second part. And then the third is thinking about how we can solve this and reduce this risk going forward. But that's a bigger challenge. With respect to the GCT, that is being worked on, competing with many other things, as you can imagine. But I'm going to try to ensure that it's expedited and brought here. With that, Mr. Speaker, I ask that the bill be read a second time.
The question is that the bill be read a second time. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? As of it. Doc.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Income Tax Act to provide for an increase in the personal income tax threshold, to provide for initial allowance and capital expenditure in respect of the purchase for renovation of industrial buildings, to give permanent effect to matters previously effected provisionally, and for connected matters read a second time.
The House will now resolve itself into a committee of the whole House to consider the bill clause by clause. Members, we have two amendments. They have been circulated. Clause 3 and Clause 6. Okay, we will proceed with Clause 1. I put Clause 1. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put Clause 2. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Minister, amendment.
Mr. Speaker, Chairman rather, I have an amendment to move with respect to Clause 3, subsection B, which has been laid before the House for the committee.
Go ahead, read it.
And it reads, to delete from subparagraph AB, subsection 3, the words year of assessment, and substitute therefore the words period referred to in subparagraphs Roman numerals 13, 14, and 15 in a year of assessment.
I put the amendment. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put Clause 3 as amendment. You have another amendment? I put Clause 3 as amended. Those in favor? Members, please. I put Clause 3 as amended. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put Clause 4. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put Clause 5. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put the amendment to Clause 6. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the amendment to Clause 6, subsection B, reads as follows. In the new paragraph 1A, delete from subparagraph 3, subsection B, the word and substitute therefore the word or, And in B, delete from subparagraph 4 the words no initial allowance shall be made and substitute therefore the words the initial allowance shall be recovered.
The amendment. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put clause 6 as amended. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put clause 7. Those in favor? I put clause 7. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put the title and enacting clause. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. The question is that the bill, having passed committee stage with 3 amendments. Those in favor? Those against? As of it.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the bill be read a third time.
No, not yet, not yet, not yet. Members, I do report that the bill have been passed committee stage with 3 amendments.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the bill be read a third time.
The question is that the bill be read a third time. Those in favor? Those against? As of it, clerk.
A bill entitled an act to amend the Income Tax Act to provide for an increase in the personal income tax threshold,
Silent,
provide
please.
for initial allowance on capital expenditure in respect of the purchase for innovation of industrial buildings, to give permanent effect to matters previously effected provisionally, and for connected matters with a third time and passed.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I ask for the recommittal of 2 items. Statement by ministers and announcement, but we will take the announcement first.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it.
Also laid on the table of the House today is a report of the Commission to inquire into the emoluments of judges of the parish courts and other specified officers, 2017.
Mr. Speaker, just a statement. And thank you for your accommodation. Just interest of. By way of letter dated April 7, 2017, the Honorable Minister of Justice established a commission to inquire into the emoluments of judges of the parish courts and other specified positions, masters in chambers of the Supreme Court, and registrars of the Supreme and Appeal Courts. In keeping with the provision of the Judicature Resident Magistrates Amendment and Change of Name Act 2016, and as approved by Cabinet Decision number 12/17 dated 27th of March of 2017. And that commission was established to A, inquire into the adequacy of salaries and other amounts payable to persons who hold specified offices in subsection 1B of the Act and the adequacy of the benefits generally payable to the holders of the specified offices, and B, make such recommendations as the Commission considers appropriate in relation to the matters specified in paragraph A above. The Commission was chaired by Mr. Leighton McKnight, a partner of PricewaterhouseCoopers, and had as its other members Ms. Minna Israel of the Mona School of Business and Management and Mrs. Michelle Robinson of the debt management consultant. In arriving at its final position with regards to salaries and other benefits of the parish judges or recommended salaries, the Commission was mindful of and attempted to balance the implication against a range of considerations, some of which are listed below, and that is continued fiscal and expenditure constraints, the wage restraints applied to other categories of employees, supply and demand dynamics in the wider legal profession, preservation of judicial independence, the relative hierarchy of the roles and compensation in the judiciary based on the award provided to the higher judiciary. The Commission also noted that notwithstanding the country's economic challenges, concerted efforts should be made to adequately remunerate parish judges, or the consequences of not doing so could be costly economically and socially. This Honourable House is reminded of the ongoing compensation review, which is aimed at a comprehensive restructuring of the compensation system in the public sector, and underpinned by a clear philosophy and ideology. The new framework will provide clarity, equity, predictability and simplicity in the administration of compensation across the public sector to include all salary and allowances. Having reviewed the Commission's report and the comments from the Ministry of Justice, and having given the positions articulated in 3 above, and in the context of the agreements reached with public sector employees or across a wide cross-section of disciplines, the Cabinet granted the increases via Cabinet decision dated May 13, 2009, similar to that approved for the wider public service, i.e. 16% over 3 years at the rate of 5%, 2% and 9%. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Paulwell. Mr. Daly.
First of all, I'd like to place on record the opposition's sincere appreciation for the work of Mr. Leighton McKnight, Ms. Minna Israel, and Mrs. Michelle Robinson. For many years, Mr. McKnight has chaired this commission, and we have never questioned, even though we have to consider the report that comes to Cabinet based on the recommendations. We have never questioned the seriousness, the work, and the thoughtfulness that this commission has put in the work for the salary and emoluments increases for parish judges, senior judges, and also for the other members of the judiciary. There's one question I want to ask the minister, since in another dispensation this report would come to me, and I would have to sit with the commission and go into the details of the recommendation before we take it to Cabinet. 61,000 for the security of the judges. I want to know if this is paid to them, or we were contemplating security systems for their homes. One of the things we admire in Jamaica over the years, unlike some countries, we have never had our senior judiciary members being assassinated and all these things. We care about their safety. Is it that you pay this in their allowance, or they engage their own security? Because the thinking at the time, the last time this was done, was that we would engage security and the Ministry of Justice pay on their behalf. Marky, we just got the report a while ago, 5 minutes ago. Usually something like this, you you spend a good time to go through and look at the recommendations. I spent a lot of time with the commission when I had this responsibility to go through and look at the housing, the robing, the laundry. One of the things we had a problem with was the library, because to keep up to date with information coming out of various jurisdictions, that is one area you have to give them extra on to be able to be abreast with the changes and developments in the world. I mean, we never had any dissent about this, the recommendations for our judges, and I'm glad that the recommendation is also made for the parish judges, because the last time, Minister, you might have been told that the recommendations were made for the senior judges, and then the parish judges, the RMs at the time, had to go negotiate on their own, which is a better deal. This is better to have it this way. But we support it. We support it. We have had a chance to see, I was listening, what is the percentage increase to each category? I didn't hear, because I was actually looking at it, trying to read. We can pass it.
No, so
with respect,
no,
I don't think it's.
No, it's been tabled. This has been tabled, not to be passed or anything like that. It's been tabled, and I'm just giving an announcement as to the cabinet decision. Now, in respect of the question that you asked, the security allowance that parish judges receive is paid to them directly for them to install systems in their homes. Now, that is in addition to the fact that parish judges are assigned, a CPO who. To the best of my knowledge, and it's called an orderly, and they accompany them throughout the day. But this allowance that you referred to is a dollar figure that's paid to a parish court judge to install in their system. I should just clarify, member, that we received the report, but the report is received in the context of what is happening overall, in what's happening in public sector compensation overall. And we, the cabinet was of the view that there ought to be, notwithstanding the special circumstances of judges, there ought to be some consistency with the adjustments to compensation across the public space, for reasons of preserving equity in the society. There are 100,000 people in the civil service and public bodies and police and nurses, teachers, etc., who have accepted a certain compensation adjustment package over a 4-year period. And we are interested in the preservation of equity in the society, and the belief is that notwithstanding the recommendations in the report, notwithstanding the peculiar some of the circumstances of judges, others have circumstances too, that there should be some consistency and similarity. And hence, the decision of the cabinet was to grant an increase to judges that bore some resemblance, not being exact, using the same 16%, even though it's over a 3-year period. 5% in the first year, 2% in the second, and 9% in the third. And just reporting that, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker,
all right.
As usual, I use these types of opportunity to make a special plea for drivers of us inside here who has a non-existent pension because it's a matter that affects the welfare of those who work for us in Parliament. And also, I think the cabinet ministers should be aware, because you are allowed helpers and gardeners. And only today I'm finding out that my helper who was with me for 15 years and paid by the government has been treated as temporary staff with no pension. I think those things we need to correct. It is really sad that people are so closely related to us, including our constituency secretaries, do not receive a pension at the end of their tenure. Minister, I think this is a matter that is crying out for urgent attention. Thank you.
Well, you know, this is a statement. Don't pass. It's a statement. So your point is well received, member.
Mr. Speaker, what is happening?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Shamodo.
Mr. Speaker, it is not intended to do any further business today, but I would like very much, before we adjourn, to remind every member here and all our colleagues that we will be meeting here tomorrow at 2 p.m. to engage in a joint meeting, including ourselves and the Senate, to pay tribute to the life of the Most Honorable Edward Seaga, ONPC. That will start at 2 p.m. sharp, because if we don't convene at 2 p.m., we will succeed in having distinguished guests, including at least 2 former Prime Ministers, sitting there waiting on us. So let us be here on time. Mr. Speaker, at 2 p.m., I'm going to expect to see the Marshal announce at that door that you are about to enter. And with that, I ask that you adjourn until that time.
The motion is that the House be adjourned until 2 o'clock tomorrow. Those in favour? Those against? As of it. This Honourable House now stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow.